The house is still. You wake not to a sound, but to a deep quiet that has settled over the vicarage like a held breath. In the darkness of your small bedroom, under the eaves, you lie for a moment with your eyes open, tracing the familiar outline of the window frame against the faintest suggestion of grey. Not yet dawn. The air is cold, the way it always is in a Lincolnshire March before the first birds begin. You know without looking at the little clock on the chest that it is just past 5, the hour you have kept now for 3 weeks, ever since your father the vicar asked if you might undertake the copying of the parish registers. Tomorrow the new book must be ready for the bishop's visitation, but you do not think of the deadline with any haste. The task will be finished in its own time. You push back the heavy counterpane and the wool blanket, moving slowly to avoid the creak of the bedstead. Your feet find the rag rug beside the bed, the braided wool cool and familiar. In the dimness, you reach for your stockings first, then your plain wool dress of dark brown stuff, the one with the narrow sleeves and the row of shell buttons at the wrist. You dress without lighting a candle, your hands knowing every hook and fastening by long habit. You brush your hair back from your forehead, twist it simply, and pin it at the nape of your neck with 2 plain hairpins. No looking glass, no fuss. The room behind you returns to silence as you ease the bedroom door open and step onto the landing. The corridor outside your room stretches toward the back staircase, the narrow servant's stair that leads directly down to the kitchen and, past the pantry, to the little passage that connects to your father's study. The floorboards are old, cut from wide Baltic pine, and they speak softly under your weight, despite your care. You pass your father's door without pausing. There is no sound from within, only the low, regular breathing you have heard every morning since you were a child. You will not rise for another hour when the housekeeper arrives to light the kitchen fire and set the kettle. You are alone in the waking world. At the foot of the back stair you turn left, not right, toward the cold kitchen, and push open the green baize door that separates the family rooms from the service part of the house. The passage here is dark as still, the only window a small frosted pane high on the wall. You walk with one hand brushing the wall to guide you, the plaster cool and slightly rough under your fingers. At the passage end you reach the study door, solid oak, with a brass knob worn bright in the center, and you turn it gently. The study greets you with a scent you have known all your life, a layered smell of old paper and beeswax from the furniture polish, coal dust from the grate, and the faint metallic tang of ink powder. The room is not entirely dark because the fire in the grate, banked last night with a layer of fine ash, still breathes a dull orange glow behind the iron fireguard. You cross to the mantelpiece with sure steps, your eyes adjusting, and take down the box of lucifer matches kept in the china match striker. Striking one produces a brief flare of sulphur that fades into the steady flame of the oil lamp you lift from its bracket. You remove the glass chimney, turn up the wicker fraction, and touch the match to it. A soft yellow light fills the room, casting long shadows from the desk and the bookshelves and the dark portrait of some long-dead bishop above the fireplace. You replace the chimney and set the lamp on the desk where its light falls in a warm pool on the blotting pad. Now you move to the window. The curtain is a heavy thing of faded green velvet pulled across on a wooden pole. You draw one side back slowly, the brass rings sliding along the rod with a whisper. Outside the glass, the world is a study in grey and black, the flat Lincolnshire fields stretching away beyond the garden wall toward the distant line of the Wolds, the straight drainage dyke that mirrors the road, the bare silhouette of St. Botolph's Tower rising from the village just beyond the churchyard yews. A thin mist lies over the lowest ground, and the sky above is the colour of tarnished pewter, with a pale band beginning to show along the eastern horizon. No light burns in any cottage window, no cart moves on the lane. The rooks in the elm trees are still folded into their nests. You stand for a long moment simply looking, letting the stillness of the land settle into your own mind. Then you turn back to the desk. You seat yourself in the familiar wooden chair with its worn tapestry cushion, adjusting it so that the light falls over your left shoulder as your father taught you. The roll-top desk is open already, the slatted cover pushed back into its housing, and everything inside waits in its proper place. To the right, a stack of fresh blotting paper cut to size, thick and cream-coloured, a little rough at the edges where the stationer's shears left their mark. Beside it, a small china inkwell, the one with the painted blue forget-me-nots. filled not yet with ink, but with a fine black powder that you will mix yourself. A glass bottle of rainwater stands next to it, and a tiny brass spoon for measuring. To the left, a wooden tray holds 3 nibs already selected, a fine gillot's barrel point for the main entries, a broader crow quill for headings, and a simple steel nib for testing ink flow. Their metal glints in the lamplight. A bone folder, a sand shaker filled with fine grey sand, a slip of clean flannel for wiping, and a small pot of beef marrow soap for your fingers, all wait in a neat row. Above the desk, on a narrow shelf, the parish register volumes stand in a line, 5 older books bound in dark calf, and 1 brand new volume still wrapped in brown paper. You reach for the water bottle first, unstoppering it carefully, and tip a small measure into the inkwell. Then you take up the brass spoon and add 3 scoops of the fine black powder, stirring slowly with the handle of an old quill kept for this purpose. The mixture turns pale grey at first, then darker as you stir, until at last it becomes the deep blue-black of usable ink. You let it rest a moment, allowing any bubbles to settle. The smell of the fresh ink, sharp and clean, joins the other smells of the study, a note of newness in the quiet old room. Now you test a nib. You choose the gillot's barrel point, screw it into the plain wooden holder, and dip only the very tip into the ink. You tap off the excess against the rim of the inkwell with a small sharp sound that breaks the silence once and then is gone. On a scrap of paper you draw a few practice strokes, a thin upstroke, a thicker downstroke, a small oval, the letter A, the letter D, the word Lincoln. The ink flows well, not too fast, not too dry. The nib glides smoothly without catching. You are satisfied. You wipe the nib clean on the flannel strip and set it down. The room has changed almost imperceptibly while you prepared. The band of light at the horizon has grown from pewter to a pale straw color, and the fields outside the window are no longer entirely featureless. You can now make out the ridge and furrow of the old glebe field, the line of a hedge, the dark shape of a cart shed. A single blackbird begins its first tentative notes from somewhere near the garden wall, a few liquid phrases that seem to ask a question and then fall silent. The study itself feels warmer now, the lamp having heated the small circle of air around the desk, though the far corners remain chilly and dim. You draw your shawl a little closer around your shoulders, a plain grey wool shawl knitted by the housekeeper's sister last winter, and pull the copybook toward you. The new register volume is still in its brown paper wrapping. You take it up and feel the weight of it, the stiff new leather of the binding, the slight give of the pages within. You untie the cotton string and fold back the paper, revealing a book as clean and unmarked as a fall of fresh snow. The leather cover is a deep oxblood color, with blind tooled lines around the border and a small gold stamp in the center reading Register of Baptisms, Marriages and Burials. You open the front board, hearing the small crackle of new glue at the hinge, and look at the first flyleaf. The paper is heavy and smooth, a little creamier than the blotting paper, with a fine lay pattern visible when you hold it to the light. 150 leaves, enough to hold the transcripts of several decades. Your task, which your father explained with his usual gentle thoroughness, is to begin filling this book with a fair copy of the entries from the oldest of the parish registers, the one covering the years from 1813 onward, the first of the printed books required by Rose's Act. A copy must be lodged with the diocesan registry in Lincoln as a safeguard against fire or damp or simple misplacement. It is work that suits your hands and your temperament exactly. You set the new register open at the first leaf, but you do not begin writing yet. Instead, you reach for the bone folder and run its smooth edge along the gutter of the page, pressing the paper flat so that it lies open without springing back. You do the same for the next few pages, moving methodically, the bone moving with a soft hiss across the surface. Then you take the small brass ruler and a hard pencil and rule faint guidelines down each page, marking the column edge for the entry number, the date, the name, the abode, and the officiating minister. Your hand is steady. The lines are straight and light, just enough to guide your writing later and easy to erase when the book is complete. You work without counting the minutes, aware only of the ruler and the paper and the steady flame of the lamp. The blackbird outside sings again, a longer phrase this time, and is answered by another from the churchyard. When the first few leaves are ruled to your satisfaction, you set the ruler aside and pick up your pen once more. You dip the galotte nib, tap away the excess, and write on the top line of the first ruled page, in your careful round hand, the heading, Baptism solemnized in the parish of Sutterby, in the county of Lincoln, in the year of our Lord 1813. The wet ink gleams for a moment in the lamplight, then begins to dull as it dries. You do not rush to blot it. Instead, you let it dry naturally, while you open the old register to its corresponding page. This older book is the color of dried tobacco leaf, its leather binding cracked along the joints but still sound. The smell that rises from it is drier and fainter than the new book, the smell of paper that has lived through 60 winters in a Lincolnshire vicarage. The ink inside varies from page to page, a deep black where a fresh nib and good ink were used, a watery brown where the pen was pressed too hard and the iron gall has faded, a spidery copperplate that speaks of a careful hand long stilled. The first entries are baptisms from January 1813, written in the hand of a vicar, whose name you know from the brass tablet in the chancel, the Reverend John Throckmorton, who served this parish for 41 years before your father's time. You rest the old book on the desk to the left of the new one, aligning the pages so that you can glance back and forth without turning your head too far. The lamplight falls evenly on both, and the deepening dawn through the window is now strong enough to throw a faint rectangle of light onto the floorboards behind you. You dip your pen once more and begin the slow, steady work of transcription. Entry number 1, the date, the child's name, the parents' names, their abode, the father's occupation. Your pen moves without hurry, forming each letter distinctly. There is no sound in the room but the tiny scratching of the nib and the soft ticking of the mantel clock, which you rarely hear because it has been there all your life, and its rhythm is part of your own. The entries follow one another in the old register and you follow them in the new. The names belong to families you know from the village even now, in 1877, though, of course, these early records name people long since grown, old, or past. A small portion of your mind registers these connections without judgment. The father of George Lusby the wheelwright, the grandmother of little Anne Clay who was buried last winter, the great-aunt of the current sexton. You write them all with the same care, each letter a small act of preservation. Outside the window the mist is lifting from the fields, shredding into long pale wisps that trail over the dike. A second blackbird has joined the first, and the two sing in alternating phrases, one from the garden wall and one from the yew tree by the lyche gate. The sky above the wolds has turned from straw to a delicate shell pink, a colour so faint it seems to exist only at the very edge of sight. You pause for a moment, lifting your pen and resting it across the inkwell, to look at the changing light. No thought of hurry disturbs you. The day will grow in its own way, and the register will be copied page by page, entry by entry. When you are ready, you dip your pen once more and turn the old book to the next leaf. You lift the first leather-bound volume from its place on the narrow shelf above the desk, where it has sat between its fellows for as long as you can remember, its spine aligned precisely with the others in a row of darkened calf and worn gold tooling. The book is heavier than it looks, the weight of thick-laid paper and solid boards pressing into your palms, and the leather has been smoothed over decades by the repeated touch of hands, your father's hands, and the hands of his predecessor, and perhaps the hands of his predecessor, and perhaps the hands of a curate or a parish clerk long before that. The surface feels cool and faintly greasy, polished by the natural oils of skin into a dull sheen, the colour of strong tea. When you set the volume on the desk and open the front board, the spine gives a soft crackle, a dry sound like the rustle of a bird moving through dead leaves, the sound of old glue and stitching stretching after a long rest. You open the book with care, supporting the front board with your left hand, so that no strain falls on the joint. The marbled end papers inside are a swirl of deep blue and ochre and a faded crimson. The colours still vivid in the centre where the light is not reached, and the paste-down bears a small rectangular bookplate with the words Sutterby Vicarage printed in simple serif type above the diocesan crest. Beneath that, in your father's handwriting, the dates of the register's use, 1813 to 1830. The paper of the first leaf gives off a scent that is older and drier than the new book. lacking the sharp tang of fresh ink and mill sizing, carrying instead the mellow breath of time, a faint mustiness that is not damp but simply age, as if the book has absorbed 60 winters of Lincolnshire air and kept them folded between its pages. Now, with the volume fully open, you see the first page of entries, and your eye travels across the surface of the paper. It is good handmade paper, with a distinct laid pattern of fine parallel lines and the occasional chain line running vertically, visible when you tilt the page to catch the lamplight. There is a watermark in the corner, a shield and a horn within a cartouche, the mark of a Dutch paper mill that supplied English stationers early in the century. The edges of the pages are slightly deckled, where they were cut from the original sheet, and the foredge has darkened over time from exposure to air, forming a pale brown border around the cream interior. You touch the paper lightly with a fingertip, feeling its slight tooth, its dry resilience, and then you draw your hand back to the blotting pad. The heading on this first page is written in a bold copperplate hand, the letters formed with heavy pressure on the downstrokes and hair-thin on the upstrokes, the ink now faded to a deep sepia brown. It reads, in ornate script with flourished capitals, "Baptism solemnized in the parish of Sutterby in the county of Lincoln, Anno Domini 1813. The date is given in Roman numerals, the letters carefully serifed, and below the heading a ruled double line in the same brown ink separates the title from the first entry. You lean a little closer, bringing the page nearer to the lamp, and you begin to read simply to settle your mind into the rhythm of the task, not yet copying, only absorbing the shape of the words. The first entry is a baptism from January the 3rd, in the hand of the Reverend John Throckmorton. The writing is small and precise, the letters a little cramped, as if the writer was conscious of the book's value and sought to fill it economically. You read George, son of William and Mary Crowder, of this parish, labourer. The downward strokes are thick and slightly splayed where the nib spread under pressure, and the thin upward strokes are so fine they nearly vanish. The ink is a dark brown now, darker than the heading, and has left a slight halo around each letter where the iron gold bit into the paper. The next entry, a week later, records the baptism of Anne, daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth Fisher, also labourer, also of this parish. The words repeat with small variations, a different child's name, a different set of parents, sometimes a farm name instead of this parish, when the family lived in one of the outlying hamlets such as Sutterby Fen or Sutterby Thorpe, places you know as clusters of 3 or 4 labourers' cottages and a small holding. You turn the page slowly, lifting the leaf by its outer corner and letting it settle onto the left-hand side of the book. The sound it makes is a soft whisper, the paper brushing against paper. The entries continue through February and March, the same pattern of names and occupations: labourer, labourer, shepherd, labourer, blacksmith, labourer. The families appear again and again, the Losbys, the Motts, the Clays, the Stennets, the Toyntons. You note, without reaching for the new copybook, how the ink varies from entry to entry. Sometimes a deep glossy black where the pen has been freshly dipped, sometimes a paler brown where the ink was running thin and the writer pushed on rather than stopped to grind more. In April of 1813 the ink changes colour abruptly to a rich black with a bluish cast, and the handwriting becomes slightly larger, more rounded, as if the vicar had just mixed a fresh batch of ink and was enjoying the flow of it from a new-cut quill. Your father once told you on a winter afternoon when you were learning to write with a steel nib, how the old Vicar Throckmorton would have used only quills, cutting them himself from goose feathers gathered at Michalmer's. You can see the evidence of it in the pages before you. The slight variation in letter width from day to day, as the quill wore down and was recut, the occasional spatter where a worn nib caught the paper, the small blots at the ends of words where the writer paused too long with a loaded pen. These marks are not errors, but the record of a living hand moving across the page, and you accept them exactly as they are. Later in the same year, around September, a second handwriting appears for a run of 3 pages, a thinner and more upright hand with longer ascenders, and you know from the parish record that this was a young curate named Mr. Bishia, Theodosius Pratt, who served here for only 18 months before moving to a living in Norfolk. His ink is grey and watery, and his entries are briefer than the vicar's, omitting the mother's maiden name in several places, a small lapse that you will have to note in the copy even though no one will ever ask you to correct it. You read on, turning page after page with the same slow care, not rushing, not searching for anything in particular, only letting the names and dates wash through your attention like water through a mill race. The sound of the mantel clock has shifted slightly. Perhaps half an hour has passed, or perhaps 3/4, and the light beyond the window has strengthened enough that the lamp's glow is no longer the brightest thing in the room. A diffused grey-white light now fills the space, picking out the grain of the floorboards and the glint of the brass inkwell and the faint dust motes that drift in the air near the window. You do not turn down the lamp because its warmth and its steady presence are part of the rhythm of the work. When you reach the marriages, which begin about a third of the way into the register on pages marked with a printed heading, the entries grow slightly longer. Here the Reverend Throckmorton recorded not only names and dates but also the condition of the parties, their ages, their occupations, and the names of witnesses. You read a marriage from June 1814 with careful attention, seeing how the groom signed his name in a firm hand, John Drayton, while the bride, Sarah Lois, could only make her mark. An ex-witness by the vicar. The entry occupies 4 lines of tight copperplate, and at the bottom the witnesses are listed: William Proctor, Anne Clipsham. The names are all familiar from the village, the same families that still sit in the same pews every Sunday, and you recognize that the Drayton's cottage is the one with the cracked chimney pot visible from the vicarage garden. You note this without sentiment, only as a small point of connection between the dry page and the living world outside the window. The burial entries, which filled a final third of the old register, are the shortest of all. Name, abode, date of burial, age, officiating minister. That is all. No cause of death, no description of the mourners, no note of the weather or the state of the churchyard path. And yet these brief lines carry their own weight, a weight of fact, unadorned. You read the entry for an infant buried in February 1815, aged 9 weeks, the child of labourer parents, the name written in a hand so faint you must hold the page close to the lamp. The ink there is pale and thin, as if the pen was running dry, or as if the writer's hand trembled. You cannot know which, but you can note the fact and copy it faithfully. Another entry records the burial of an old woman of 87, the oldest person in the book, and her name is given with the simple prefix widow before her surname. The minister was the curate Pratt, and you can see where he pressed too hard and left a small blot on the tail of the final letter. As you turn the pages of the burial section, moving into the years 1820 and 1822 and 1822 and 1825, you notice a gradual shift in the color of the ink. The deep black of the early pages has faded everywhere to a brown, but the brown itself varies from a warm chestnut on some leaves to a cold grey-brown on others, depending perhaps on the quality of the ink powder used that year, or the iron content, or the amount of gum arabic mixed in. Some entries have faded so much that the letters are barely distinguishable from the paper, and you will need to hold the page at a sharp angle to the window light when you copy them, letting the shadows in the indentations reveal the words. The book itself seems to carry a record of the vicar's supplies, his economy, his occasional inattention. In the year 1829, a final change occurs in the handwriting. The Reverend Throckmorton's entries stop, replaced by a new hand that is smaller, sharper, and more angular, written with a steel nib rather than a quill. You can tell the steel nib by the uniform thinness of the upstrokes and the way the ink lies more on the surface of the paper without biting in so deeply. This is your father's hand, the writing of a young man newly ordained and freshly appointed to the living of Sutterby, and you recognize the shape of his letters from the notes he still leaves on the hall table about parish business. His entries are neat and efficient, with fewer flourishes but greater consistency. He used the same ink recipe you mixed this morning, though his hand is firmer on the page. You read a baptism he recorded in October 1829, the child's name given in full, the parents' names spelled with care, the abode listed as Sutterby Finn Cottages. The corners of the page here are darker than the rest, as if someone once turned them with a sooty thumb, but otherwise the entry is clear. During the years that follow, the 1830s and beyond, the register records the life of the village without comment. You see the names you know, and the names you do not. Some families vanish entirely after a cluster of burials. New names appear in the baptism pages, belonging to labourers who came into the parish from elsewhere to take up work on the largest farm. The occupations evolve slowly, By 1835 there is a mention of a railway navvy lodging in the parish and marrying a local girl, and by 1838 a man is listed not as labourer but as engine driver, though you cannot tell whether this means a steam engine on a farm or a locomotive. Your father's handwriting, however, remains as steady as his faith, line after line, page after page, a continuous human record stretching toward the present. You close the old register gently at last, when you have read through the 1850s and reached the point where your own memory of the parish begins to overlap with the written entries. The book's spine settles with a small sigh, and you lay your palm flat on the worn cover for a moment, feeling the subtle warmth the leather has absorbed from the lamp. The morning has fully established itself now, the grey light replaced by a clean, pale daylight that washes the fields in silver. The blackbirds have stopped singing, and in their place you hear the distant murmur of rooks beginning their day among the elms. You have not yet written a single word in the new copybook, but you have done the necessary preparation. You have let the old register speak its quiet language into your attention, and you have learned its small variations, its difficult passages, its steady rhythm. When you are ready, you will open both books side by side and begin the transcription, carrying each entry across from one volume to the other as carefully as you might carry a candle flame across a draughty room. For now, you sit at the desk with your hands resting loosely on the blotting pad, watching the daylight grow, feeling no urgency, knowing that the work will begin precisely when you pick up the pen. The new register volume sits before you on the desk, still half wrapped in its brown paper, the string you untied earlier coiled neatly beside the blotting pad. You reach for it now with both hands, lifting it slightly to feel the weight and balance of the binding, the way the heavy millboard covers press evenly against the pages within. The paper wrapper is thick and slightly rough, the kind of sturdy brown paper the stationer in Horncastle uses for parcels, and it has protected the book during its journey by carrier's cart along the turnpike, and then by the village boy who brought it to the vicarage door yesterday afternoon. You run a finger along the fold lines where the paper was creased around the corners, noting the crispness of the edges, the complete absence of wear. This book has been nowhere, touched by no one but the binder and the stationer, and now by you. You fold back the remaining paper carefully, working it free from the boards, and set the wrapping aside to use later for some household purpose. Beneath it, the leather cover emerges fully into the lamplight, a deep oxblood colour with a fine grain pressed into the calf hide, the sort of grain that resembles the surface of a dried seed pod. The binding is plain but honest. Blind tool rules run around the perimeter of both front and back boards, a double line spaced a 1/4 inch apart, intersecting at the corners in neat mitres. The spine has 5 raised bands, each one a ridge where the binder's cord lies beneath the leather, and the compartments between them hold a simple gilt fleuron. At the centre of the front board, a small gold-embossed circle bears the words Register of Baptisms, Marriages and Burials in serifed capitals, with a tiny cross at the top. The gold still has its bright, unburnished gleam, not yet dulled by handling. You open the front board slowly, hearing the slight crackle of new glue in the joint, a sound that speaks of clean adhesives and fresh sewing. The end papers are a muted sage green, plain and unpatterned, the colour of dried sage leaves from the kitchen garden, and they are pasted smooth onto the inside of the boards with only a single tiny air bubble near the top corner of the front paste down. The flyleaf is a single folded sheet of the same heavy paper that makes up the register pages, and it is entirely blank except for a small pencil mark in the lower right corner, probably the binder's collation mark. You turn the flyleaf and arrive at the first page of the register proper, a wide expanse of cream-white paper that seems to glow faintly in the combined light of lamp and window. No mark of any kind has yet touched it, no ink, no pencil, no finger smudge, and the sight of such perfect emptiness fills you with a quiet sense of readiness. Much of the work of preparing a copybook lies not in the writing, but in the ruling, a task you have learned to approach with patience because it sets the foundation for everything that follows. You take up the small brass ruler from its place in the tray, a 6-inch length of polished metal with a beveled edge and a little hook at one end that holds it steady against the edge of the desk. It has been in this study since your father's earliest days, and before that, perhaps, it belonged to old Mr. Throckmorton, for the brass shows a dark patina in the hollows where fingers have gripped it over many years. You wipe it once with the flannel rag to remove any dust, then lay it across the top margin of the first page. The old register shows you the column widths you will need: a narrow column for the entry number, a broader one for the date, a wide main column for the names and particulars, a narrower column for the officiating minister. You measure these proportions with the ruler, not by marking inches, but by holding the ruler against the old book and transferring the spacing visually to the new page. You take up a hard lead pencil, one sharpened to a fine point with the little penknife that lies in the tray, and you draw the first vertical line from the top margin to the bottom, keeping the ruler firmly pressed with your left hand. The pencil makes a faint grey track on the paper, light enough to erase later with a piece of bread or a soft rubber, but clear enough to guide your pen when the time comes. The sound of the pencil moving across the paper is a soft granular whisper, a sound that seems to belong to the quiet of early morning. You rule the second column line, then the third and fourth, checking each against the old register to ensure the spacing will accommodate the longest names and the most cramped entries. The header space you reserve at the top of each page with a horizontal line drawn across the column heads, leaving room for the year and the heading in your own copperplate. You work methodically down the first leaf, then turn to the second leaf and rule it with the same care, measuring again because the paper may have shifted slightly in binding, and you do not trust your eye alone. Each leaf takes perhaps 3 minutes to rule, and there are many leaves ahead, but you do not count them. You simply move from one to the next, the ruler sliding, the pencil whispering, the columns growing in their faint grey lines like a field laid out for planting. The ink, which you mixed earlier and let settle, now sits ready in the china inkwell with its blue forget-me-nots. You inspect it by tilting the inkwell slightly, seeing how the liquid coats the inside of the white china with a film of deep indigo that looks almost black until the light shines through it. The surface of the ink is still and glassy, free of dust specks because you kept the well covered with its little brass lid while ruling. You uncover it now and stir it once more with the old quill handle, a slow clockwise rotation that mixes any settled pigment back into suspension. The faint metallic smell rises, the smell of ground oak gall and ferrous sulfate and gum arabic dissolved in rainwater, the same recipe that scribes have used for centuries. You dip a clean thin stick into the ink and lift it, watching the drip form and fall back, judging the consistency. It is neither too thick, which would clog the nib and leave blobs, nor too thin, which would spread in the paper fibers and blur the edges of your letters. It is exactly right, a smooth, free-flowing ink with good body and a promise of permanence. Now you must select a nib, and this is a choice you make with attention because the right nib makes the difference between a day of ease and a day of scratchy frustration. From the wooden tray you take up 3 nibs and lay them on the blotting pad side by side, their metal points glinting under the lamp. The first is the Gilotte's barrel point, your usual favorite, with a fine tip and a gentle flexibility that allows a slight swell on the downstroke without requiring heavy pressure. The second is a broader crow quill, better suited to headings and ornamental capitals. Its point stiffer and less forgiving, but capable of producing a clean, thick line. The third is a simple steel nib of the sort used in schoolrooms, serviceable but unrefined. You pick up the Gilotte's and examine it closely, holding it up to the lamp so that you can see the tines and the tiny iridium tip welded to the point. No rust, no misalignment, the slit exactly centered. You screw it into the plain wooden holder, turning it slowly until the ferrule grips the base of the nib securely. Then you test the fit with a slight wiggle. It holds firm. You dip only the very tip of the nib into the inkwell, letting it rest there for a count of 2. Then you draw it up the inside of the rim to remove any surplus. On the scrap paper kept for this purpose, you make a few test strokes just as you did before, a series of thin lines and thicker ones, a small oval, the letter E, the letter T, the word Sutterby. The ink flows without interruption, and the nib glides without catching, leaving a line that is crisp at the edges and uniform in colour. You are satisfied and you wipe the nib clean with the flannel strip, laying the pen across the inkwell tray, so that the point rests on a small piece of folded cloth and the handle is within easy reach. The other implements of the copyist's trade now claim your attention, and you arrange them on the desk in the precise order you will need them. To the right of the copybook goes the sand shaker, a small pewter canister with a perforated domed top that you fill from the bag of fine grey sand kept in the desk drawer. The sand is silver grey and glassy, fine enough to pass through the holes without clogging, and its purpose is to dry the ink quickly when you have finished a page, absorbing the surface moisture so that the facing page does not become smudged. You test the shaker with a gentle tap over the scrap paper, and a fine dusting of sand falls in an even pattern. Beside the sand shaker you place the blotting paper, several sheets of it cut to the size of the register leaves, thick and soft and cream-coloured, ready to slip between pages as you work. The blotting paper has its own quiet smell, a clean cellulose scent with a hint of the mill where it was made. To the left of the copybook, you set the slip of clean flannel rag folded into a small square for wiping the nib when it accumulates dried ink or paper fibers. Beside it goes the small pot of beef marrow soap, a translucent amber ointment that you will rub into your fingers whenever they begin to cramp from the long hours of holding the pen. The soap has a mild, tawlery scent, not unpleasant, and it keeps the skin supple without greasing the pen handle. You also place within reach the bone folder, the small brass ruler, the pot of ink, and the old register volume that will serve as your source, positioning it on a small angled rest made from a wooden book cradle so that the page you are copying from lies flat and at a comfortable reading angle. The cradle is a simple thing, 2 angled boards hinged together with a strip of leather, but it spares the spine of the old book and makes it easier to glance back and forth between the source and the copy. The arrangement of the desk now resembles a small workshop, every tool in its place. The lamp sits at the back left corner, casting its circle of warm yellow light across the open pages and leaving the rest of the study in a penumbral dimness that makes the room feel smaller and more intimate than it does at midday. The shadows of the inkwell and the sand shaker stretch long across the wood, and the brass ruler catches the light in a bright line along its edge. You take a moment to let your eyes travel over the desk, confirming that nothing is missing, that the paper is ruled, the ink is mixed, the nib is fitted, the rag and soap and blotting sheet are all within easy reach. This moment of final check is not anxiety, but the quiet satisfaction of a worker who knows her tools and trusts them. The room around you has continued its slow transformation while you prepared. The early morning light that was a mere band on the horizon when you first sat down has now fully entered the window, filling the study with a cool silvery illumination that overlaps the warmer circle of the lamp. The 2 lights mingle on the desk, the yellow of the flame and the blue-grey of the overcast sky combining to produce a neutral clarity that is ideal for close work. Dust motes drift in the air near the window, tiny flecks of pale light that rise and fall on invisible currents. Outside, the mist has entirely burned away, revealing the full sweep of the glebe field and the hedge beyond it, bare and twiggy, waiting for spring. The rooks are more active now, their caws carrying faintly through the glass, and a distant cart can be heard somewhere on the Sutterby road, the slow clop of a heavy horse and the rumble of iron wheels on packed earth. Sounds so far away they seem to come from another world entirely. You pick up the old register and open it again to the first page of baptisms, the one with the year 1813 written in Reverend Throckmorton's ornate copperplate. You set it on the book cradle and angle it so that the lamplight falls across the page without shadowing the gutter. Then you draw the new copybook toward you, opening it to the first ruled leaf, the faint grey column lines waiting like roads on a map. You take up the pen once more, dipping it with the same careful motion, tapping away the excess, and you hold it poised just above the paper. The moment is full of stillness, a small pause before the work begins in earnest, and it holds within it all the calm of the morning, all the quiet of the study, all the steady patience of the long hours ahead. You breathe once, slowly, and lower the nib to the page. You lower the nib to the first ruled line of the new copybook and begin. The heading you wrote earlier, announcing the year 1860 in your careful round hand, now waits beneath the lamp for the entries that will follow, and you fill the space beneath it with the first transcription of the morning. The old register lies open on its cradle to the corresponding page, the entries for January of that year written in your father's firm and slightly angular hand, the ink a dark brown with the characteristic cool undertone of the iron gall recipe he has always preferred. You read the first entry to yourself, absorbing the shape of the words, then look back to your own page and write, Number 1, January the 8th, William John, son of John and Mary Ann Teasdale, of Sutterby, labourer. The nib moves across the paper with a faint scratch, the line flowing behind it like a thin, dark thread, unspooling onto the cream surface, and when you reach the final letter, you lift the pen and pause to examine the result. The letters are even in size, the spacing regular, the ink a true black with no blurring, and you are satisfied. The second entry follows without delay. Number 2, January the 15th. Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas and Sarah Lusby, of this parish, labourer. You know the Lusby family from the village, the same Lusbys who appear in the older pages of the register stretching back decades, and you note without comment how the father named here must be the grandfather of the current Thomas Lusby who works the glebe field for your father. The connection forms in your mind as a quiet recognition, like seeing a familiar face in a crowd, and then you let it go and dip your pen for the next entry. The pattern of the work is now established, a gentle oscillation between the old book and the new, the source and the copy, your eyes moving from the faded original to the fresh page and back again in a rhythm that soon becomes as natural as breathing. January gives way to February in the old register, and you transcribe the entries one after another. Baptisms on the 5th, the 12th, the 19th, the 26th, each one following the same formula of name, parentage, abode, occupation. The repetition is not dull, but rather soothing, a long, slow sequence of human facts set down without embellishment, and you find that your hand settles into a steady pace, the letters forming themselves with less conscious effort as the morning wears on. Sometimes you pause to flex your fingers, rubbing a little of the beef marrow soap into the first and second joints, where the pressure of the pen holder begins to make itself felt, and the cool ointment eases the small ache so that you can continue without strain. Other times you pause to dip the pen, the nib descending into the dark pool of ink and emerging with a gleaming bead at the tip, which you tap gently against the rim of the well before returning to the page. The February entries bring a run of familiar village names that you have known since childhood: the Motts, the Clays, the Stennets, the Toyntons. A baptism on February the 12th records: Anne, daughter of Joseph and Elizabeth Clay, of Sutterby Fen Cottages, Shepherd, and you remember old Joseph Clay, now long dead, who used to sit in the back pew of St. Botolph's with his weathered hands folded on his stick. The memory is faint and without detail, merely a shape in the dimness of the church nave, and it passes through your mind without disturbing the flow of the work. You write the entry with the same care you give to every other, the letters clear and distinct, and then you move on to the next. March arrives in the register with a slight change in the ink, a fresh dipping that left the entries for that month darker and more glossy on the old page. You copy them in your own consistent hand, not attempting to reproduce the variations of the original, but simply recording the information, which is the purpose of the copy. The weather outside the window, meanwhile, has continued its slow transition, the pale silver of early morning deepening into a duller grey as a thin overcast spreads from the west. The light in the study flattens slightly, the shadows softening, and the lamp's glow becomes less distinct against the general illumination. You do not turn the lamp down because its warmth contributes something beyond mere brightness, a sense of companionship in the quiet room. April of 1860 brings a cluster of baptisms that suggest a wave of births in the parish during the early spring. You transcribe 5 entries for that month, more than any month so far that year, and note that 3 of the fathers are listed simply as labourer, while 1 is a blacksmith and 1 a carter. The carter's child was baptized on April the 22nd with the name George Henry, son of William and Harriet Dawkins, of Sutterby Thorpe, and the abode tells you that this family lived in the small hamlet a mile to the east where the road bends toward the Wolds. You know the Dawkins cottage by sight, a small brick house with a steep pantile roof and a narrow garden that runs down to the roadside ditch, and you have seen the carter himself driving his team along the Horncastle Road on market days, a slow-moving figure perched on the front board of a wagon. And his recognition, like the others, comes and goes without breaking the surface of your concentration. As you move through May and June, the names repeat in different combinations, the same few dozen families of the parish appearing again and again in the register, and you begin to sense the shape of the village in the middle of the century, a small self-contained world of labourers and shepherds and blacksmiths and carters. their lives recorded in these brief entries that ask no questions and offer no judgments. The ink in your copybook dries quickly in the cool, dry air of the study, and you blot each page with a sheet of the thick cream blotting paper before turning to the next, pressing it down gently with the flat of your hand to absorb any lingering moisture. The blotting paper now carries a faint reversed image of your writing, a ghost of the page you have just finished, and you set it aside and take up a fresh sheet for the next leaf. July and August of 1860 occupy a full page and a half of the old register, the entries written in your father's hand with no sign of haste, despite the warm weather that must have made the study uncomfortable. You copy them with the same measured pace, dipping the pen at the end of every fourth or fifth line depending on the length of the names, and you notice that the ink in the well has begun to thicken slightly from evaporation. You add a few drops of rainwater from the glass bottle, stirring with the quill handle until the consistency is restored, and then you continue. The sound of the pen on the paper, the soft rustle of pages turning, the distant caw of rooks from the elm trees, these are the only noises that mark the passage of the morning, and they merge into a continuous quiet background against which the work proceeds without interruption. By September the entries grow sparser, only 2 baptisms recorded that month and 3 in October, and you sense the seasonal pattern that you have observed in the register before, more births in the spring months, fewer as the year wanes toward winter. You record a baptism on October the 14th for a child named Sarah Ann, daughter of Robert and Martha Stennett, whose abode is given as Sutterby Parish and whose father's occupation is labourer out of work, a phrase that appears for the first time in this section of the register. You copy it without alteration just as your father wrote it, because the copy must be faithful to the original, and because the words themselves are only a statement of fact, recorded without comment in the dry ecclesiastical hand. The agricultural depression that has tightened its grip on the county through the late 1870s was already casting its shadow back into earlier years, and the register shows it in these small notations, brief asides in the steady record of parish life. November and December bring fewer entries still, and you complete the year 1860 with a single baptism on Christmas Day, a child brought to the church in the cold morning and recorded as John Christmas, son of Samuel and Mary Ann Toynton, labourer. The name Christmas given to a child born on or near the feast is a small marker of folk practice, and you have seen other such names in the older volumes: Easter, Pentecost, even a child named Epiphany in the 1820s. You write it faithfully, then rule a line beneath the final entry and write the total number of baptisms for the year in a small neat numeral at the foot of the page, a practice your father follows in the original and which you copy into the new book as a matter of completeness. The year 1861 begins on a fresh page, and you turn both the old register and the copybook to the new leaf, aligning them on the cradle and the desk. The January light outside the window has shifted again, as the thin overcast thickened into a proper grey blanket, and the study has grown dimmer, the lamp now once again the primary source of illumination on the desk. You take a moment to trim the wick, which has begun to smoke slightly, using the small brass scissors kept in the tray, and the flame steadies and brightens. Then you return to the register and find the first baptism of the new year, recorded on January the 6th, the feast of the Epiphany. The child's name is James, son of William and Sarah Proctor, of Sutterby, labourer, and you write it in the copybook as the first entry beneath the new heading. The months of 1861 proceed under your pen with the same steady rhythm, the entries following the familiar pattern that you now know so well you could almost write them from memory. But you do not write from memory. You check every name against the original, verifying the spelling and the date and the officiating minister's name, which is always your father's except for 2 Sundays in July when a visiting curate from Horncastle took the service while your father was laid up with a summer cold. The curate's handwriting is rounder and less angular than your father's, the ink a paler grey as if he mixed it too thin, and he recorded the abode simply as Parish of Sutterby rather than the more specific designations your father prefers. You copy these variations without remark, preserving the small inconsistencies that make the original register a human document. By the late spring of 1861, a subtle change becomes apparent in the register. The entries are fewer, the gaps between baptism dates longer, and you realize that this must reflect the tightening of the agricultural depression that began to affect the county in earnest around this time. Young families perhaps delaying baptism or moving away in search of work. Nevertheless, you continue copying each entry with the same attention, the pen moving back and forth between inkwell and page, the letters forming line after line of plain text that fills the ruled columns with a slow accumulation of names and dates. The summer months pass in the register with only a handful of entries, and you record them without hurry, taking time to blot each page thoroughly, because the air in the study has grown a little more humid as the day outside warms slightly, and the ink requires longer to dry. You notice that the pages of the old register for this period have a faint water stain in the lower right corner, a pale tide mark that suggests the book was once left on a windowsill during a rain shower. But the writing is still legible, and you copy it without difficulty. The stain is simply another part of the book's history, and you do not pause to wonder about it. As you work through the autumn of 1861, the names continue their quiet parade. A Mott, a Clay, a Lusby, a Dawkins, a new family named Singleton who appear for the first time in the register and whose abode is given as Sutterby, Fun, labourer. You have not encountered the Singletons in the older pages, and you suppose they must have come into the parish from somewhere else, perhaps from the fen edge near Rebsby or Marham le Fen, drawn by the hope of work that was already growing scarce. The thought passes without weight, and you finish the entry and move on to the next. The year ends with a scattering of December baptisms, and you close the leaf for 1861 feeling the steady satisfaction of progress made. The copybook now holds 2 full years of transcriptions, the pages filling nicely with your even hand, and you pause for a moment to flex your fingers and drink a sip of water from the cup that waits at the corner of the desk. The water is cool and clean, tasting faintly of the stone jug, and you set the cup down again precisely where it was. The year 1862 opens in the old register with a baptism on New Year's Day, which your father recorded in his usual hand, but with a slight tremor visible in the downstrokes, and you wonder whether the cold in the church that morning made his fingers stiff. You know the stone chill of St. Morning made his fingers stiff. But also in January, the way the cold seems to rise from the floor, flags and grip the bones, and you can picture him standing at the font in his surplice, with his breath faintly visible in the air. The entry itself is for a child named William, son of John and Maria Toynton, and you write it with a steady hand into the copybook beneath the new heading for the year. The entries for 1862 are sparse from the beginning. Only 2 baptisms in the whole of January and none at all in February. A silence in the register that speaks of the hard winter and the deepening depression. You copy what there is to copy, and when you reach the first blank page after the February entries, you check the old register carefully to ensure that no pages have been skipped or stuck together. But there is simply a gap when no children were brought for baptism. The blankness is part of the record too, and you note it with a small dash in the margin of the copybook, and then move forward to March, where a single entry records the baptism of a child named Thomas Edward, son of Edward and Anne Singleton. Establishing the new family further in the parish, April of 1862 brings 3 baptisms, the most in any month for that year, and you record them in succession, 2 children of labourers and 1 of a shepherd, the familiar pattern reasserting itself briefly. The shepherd's child was baptized on April the 20th with the name Mary Elizabeth, daughter of Joseph and Elizabeth Clay, and you recognize the parents as the same couple whose earlier child, Anne, you copied from the 1860 entries. The families grow and change in the register, their small increases recorded in entries spaced across the years, and your transcription preserves these connections without highlighting them, simply laying down the facts on the clean cream pages. By summer the entries have slowed again, and you find yourself copying only a handful more baptisms for the remainder of 1862, the agricultural depression having driven some families away and left others with little cause for celebration. You copy each entry with the same care, the nib moving across the paper in the steady rhythm that has sustained the work all morning, and when you reach the final baptism of the year, recorded on November the 30th, you rule a line beneath it and write the small total at the foot of the page, a modest number that reflects the lean times. Then you set the pen down across the inkwell, wipe the nib with a flannel rag, and sit back in the wooden chair for a moment. letting your hands rest on the blotting pad while you look at the filled pages of the copybook. The morning has passed into early afternoon without your noticing. The light outside the window now a steady grey-white that holds neither morning's promise nor evening's shadow, and the study is quiet, but for the soft tick of the mantel clock and the distant call of a pheasant from the glebe field. The baptisms of 1860 through 1862 are now copied, a faithful record carried from one book to the other, and the work waits patiently for the next section to begin. You turn from the baptisms now, lifting the leaves of the old register carefully until you reach the middle section where the printed heading Marriages appears in bold type across a fresh page, and you feel the slight change in the paper under your fingers, a subtle difference in thickness between the baptism pages that have been handled more frequently and these marriage leaves that lie a little stiffer from less use. The register opens to reveal a new format, the columns ruled slightly wider to accommodate more information, because a marriage entry must hold more than a baptism: the date, the full names of both parties, their ages, their condition, their occupations, their residencies at the time of marriage, and the names of 2 witnesses. All of this must fit into a space not much larger than your palm, and the vicar who recorded these entries, your own father in his careful upright hand, managed the crowding with a disciplined economy of lettering that you now study before dipping your pen. The marriage section begins in the same year you have just left, 1860, and the first entry is dated April the 2nd, a Monday after Easter, when the church would still have held the faint scent of lilies. You read the entry through once before you begin to copy, letting the words settle. George Edward Proctor, age 24. Bachelor, labourer of this parish. Married to Mary Ann Clay, age 20. Spinster, also of this parish, after banns, in the presence of William Proctor and Sarah Lewis. The handwriting on this page is particularly neat, as if your father had taken extra time with the pen because a marriage is a solemn public record, and you note the slight flourish on the capital letters that he rarely uses in the briefer baptism entries. You dip the gillot nib, tap off the excess, and write the heading for the new section across the top of your fresh page in the copybook. Then begin transcribing the details line by line, your own hand, smaller and rounder than your father's but equally clear. The second entry follows on April the 16th, a spring wedding between a shepherd named Joseph Mott and a farmer's daughter from Sutterby Thorpe, and as you copy, you notice that the bride could only make her mark, a small X witnessed by your father, while the groom signed his name in a large, deliberate script that suggests a man who learned his letters at a dame school and never forgot the pride of them. The contrast between the 2 marks on the page, the flowing signature and the simple cross, speaks of the uneven distribution of learning in the parish, and you record the mark with the same careful notation your father used, drawing the X precisely where it appears in the original, then adding the words "her mark" in parentheses, just as he did. You pause for a moment to flex your fingers, feeling the small ache in the knuckle of your index finger where the pen holder has pressed all morning, and you work a dab of the beef marrow soap into the joint, rubbing slowly until the stiffness eases. May brings a cluster of marriages in the old register, as May always does in country parishes, the couples coming to the church in the weeks after Easter, when the lambing was done and the fields were dry enough to spare a few hours for celebration. You copy an entry for a carter named Thomas Dawkins and his bride Harriet Singleton, both of Sutterby Parish, married on May the 7th after banns, the witnesses listed as John Dawkins and Martha Stennett. The names cross and recross the village families you know, connecting them in patterns that the register preserves without comment. Then another wedding on May the 21st between a labourer and a servant girl from the rectory at Myram le Fen, and this entry is interesting because your father noted the bride's place of employment rather than simply her parish, a small human detail that sets this couple apart from the others. You copy it faithfully, adding no remark of your own, and blot the page with a clean sheet. The window to your left has lightened further as the morning edged into afternoon, the grey overcast breaking slightly to allow a pale wash of sunlight through the high clouds, and the garden outside has come to life with the sounds of early summer. A chaffinch calls from the stone wall that borders the vicarage garden, its song a bright cascade of notes that repeats, and from further off the rooks and the elm trees continue their low conversational cawing, a sound as constant as the ticking of the mantel clock. You lift your head for a moment to look out at the garden, seeing the first green buds on the currant bushes near the kitchen door, and the damp earth of the vegetable bed where the housekeeper has begun to turn the soil. And then you return your gaze to the desk where the two books wait open and patient. June of 1860 contains only one marriage, recorded on the 11th, and you copy it with the same measured pace, noting that the groom was a widower of 47 and the bride a widow of 43, both from the parish and married by license rather than banns, a practical arrangement that avoided the public calling of intentions and suited their station as older people who had already buried their first spouses. The witnesses were the parish clerk and his wife, and your father's handwriting in this entry is particularly plain, without flourishes, as if the occasion called for dignity rather than celebration. You rule a line beneath it and write the total number of marriages for 1860 in the margin, then turn the page. The year 1861 opens its marriage record with a February wedding, unusual for the season, and you copy the names of a young couple who came from the fen cottages to marry in the middle of a hard winter. The groom was a labourer and the bride listed as a domestic servant, and you imagine them trudging along the lane in the cold with the witnesses, their breath puffing white in the air of the church porch. The entry is brief, the ink a little pale because your father was using a batch of ink powder that proved less than satisfactory that winter, as he once mentioned over supper, and you hold the page closer to the lamp to make certain you read the witnesses' names correctly before copying them. Spring of 1861 brings the usual rush of April and May weddings, the couples arriving at the church door in their Sunday best while the blackthorn bloomed in the hedgerows, and you transcribe each entry with the same methodical attention, the nib of your pen tracing the names across the clean new page. You copy the marriage of a blacksmith's apprentice to a labourer's daughter, the banns having been called on 3 successive Sundays in March, and you note the names of the witnesses, a brother and a cousin, the small network of kinship extending itself in these legal records. The afternoon light has now steadied into a uniform pearly grey that casts no shadows, and the lamp on the desk has become once again the brightest point in the room, its flame steady behind the clean glass chimney. July of 1861 presents an entry that gives you a brief pause, because the groom's occupation is listed not as labourer or shepherd, but as engine driver, the same unfamiliar term you noticed in the older register pages from the 1830s, and this time your father has added a small note in the margin reading Agricultural Engine, Sutterby Grange, a clarification that tells you the man worked with one of the steam-powered threshing machines that were beginning to appear on the larger farms despite the Depression. You copy the note into the margin of the new book as well, since it belongs to the record, and the engine driver's bride was a girl from Horncastle who signed her name in a neat schoolroom hand, evidence of some education beyond the parish. August weddings are fewer, the harvest beginning to weigh on the farmers' minds, and you record a single marriage that month between a shepherd and a woman who had been in service at the big house in Revsby. The entry includes the fact that the bride was given away by her employer, a Mr. Thompson, and you store the name in your memory without reflection. September brings no marriages at all in 1861, and October only one. A quiet month when the leaves were falling and the churchyard yews stood dark against the grey sky. The couple, a pair of middle-aged labourers who had waited many years to marry, and now did so with a minimum of ceremony. You copy the spare details and blot the page, feeling the steady satisfaction of the work moving forward. The year 1862 begins with a marriage in January, the 22nd, another winter wedding made necessary perhaps by the demands of work or the convenience of family, and you transcribe the entry with the scent of fresh ink drifting up from the page. The groom was a carter, and the bride a girl from Sutterby Fen, and both made their mark. 2 small crosses that sit side by side on the original page, the ink of the marks slightly blotted where the nib rested too long. You reproduce the crosses with the word mark written beside each, and then you move on to the next entry, a February marriage that lists the groom as a widower with 2 small children, the bride a spinster of 30 from the next parish. The witnesses, the sexton and his wife. March of 1862 is empty. No weddings recorded during the Lenten season when the church discouraged marriage, and you note the gap with a small dash in the margin before turning to April, where a double wedding on Easter Monday fills a full page of the old register. 2 sisters marrying 2 brothers from the same family of labourers, the witnesses overlapping, the handwriting slightly hurried as if your father was trying to record both ceremonies before the couples left the vestry. You copy the unusual entry with care, untangling the two sets of names and making sure you assign each bride to the correct groom, a small puzzle that absorbs your attention completely for several minutes. May of 1862 brings 3 more marriages, and you work through them steadily, the light through the window now beginning to take on the first faint suggestion of the late afternoon, a subtle lengthening of the shadows on the garden wall. The names on the page are all familiar by now, the small cast of village characters repeating through the seasons, and you write them down with the gentle recognition of someone who has known these families all her life. June yields 1 wedding, July another, and then the register falls quiet again through the late summer and autumn, reflecting the lean years of the early 1860s when the agricultural depression tightened and young people left the parish in search of work elsewhere. A marriage in November of 1862 closes the year, a modest ceremony for a couple who had both been in service at the vicarage briefly, the bride a kitchen maid and the groom a gardener, and your father's handwriting in this entry shows a slight tremor that might have been the cold or might have been the emotion of marrying 2 young people he knew well. You copy it and then rest your pen across the inkwell, wiping the nib with the flannel rag, and you lean back in the wooden chair for a moment to let your eyes rest on the window, the garden outside now in full afternoon light, the chaffinch long since flown from the wall, the rooks settled into silence in the elms. The marriage section of the copybook has grown by several pages, the entries marching down the ruled columns in your steady hand, and the old register lies open on its cradle with its secrets faithfully transferred. You'll continue soon, but for now you pause, your hands loose on the blotting pad, your breathing slow and even. You turn now to the burial pages, the final section of the old register, and the book falls open easily to this part because the leaves here have been turned to more often than the marriages. The weight of grief pressing more frequently than the weight of joy in a country parish. The paper under your fingers feels different, the surface slightly softer from the repeated touch of hands that came to this section seeking a name, a date, an age, the bare facts of a life reduced to 3 or 4 lines of copperplate script, and you notice that the corners of these pages are more worn than any other part of the book, the fibers frayed where thumbs have turned them in haste or in sorrow. The light from the lamp catches the page at a low angle, revealing the fine scratches on the paper surface, the small creases near the gutter, the faint smudge of a finger mark that has been there for years and will remain there always. The burial entries are the briefest in the register, and this brevity is itself a kind of statement. Your father recorded only what was required by the printed headings: name, abode, date of burial, age, and the officiating minister. No cause of death, no description of the weather or the mourners, no note of the sermon text or the hymns sung at the graveside. And yet within these spare lines a great deal of village history resides, the pattern of hard winters and sickly summers, the clusters of infant deaths that speak of fever or poor nourishment, the long gaps where old people lived on into their 80s, and the sudden rashes of entries that mark an outbreak of something that swept through the cottages and left the parish diminished. You have seen these pages before, on occasions when your father needed to check a date for a parishioner or to verify a grave location in the churchyard, but you have never read them straight through as you must now, and you settle yourself in the chair with the knowledge that this section will require a different kind of attention, a willingness to let the names pass without lingering over any single one. The first burial of 1860 is recorded on January the 4th, a child of 11 months, the son of a labourer, and your father's handwriting in this entry is careful but without any special emphasis, simply the facts set down in order. You read the name, the abode, the age, and you copy them into the new book with the same economy, your pen forming the letters without flourish. The second entry follows on January the 7th, an old woman of 79, widow of a shepherd, her abode given as Sutterby village, and you note that she was buried by the curate from Horncastle, who was assisting your father that winter. The curate's handwriting is the same round pale script you saw in the baptism pages, and you copy it with the same fidelity you give to your father's hand, making no distinction between them. January of 1860 proves to have been a hard month in the parish, the burial entries coming thickly down the page, 6 of them in the space of 3 weeks, and you transcribe each one with the steady rhythm that has carried you through the baptisms and marriages. The names are those of labourers and their wives, a shepherd, 2 infants, a carter's widow, and as you write you picture the churchyard in winter, the bare yews and the frost-hardened ground, and the small procession of villagers wrapped in their dark coats crossing the lane from the church porch. The image is not sad exactly, it is simply true, a fact of parish life, and it passes through your mind without disturbing the flow of the work. February and March of 1860 are quieter months, only 2 burials recorded in each, and you copy them with the same methodical pace, dipping the pen at the end of each entry and tapping away the excess ink before beginning the next. The nib has worn slightly with the long morning's work, the iridium tip still smooth, but the steel a little more flexible than when you began, and you adjust your pressure accordingly, writing with a lighter touch that produces a thinner line on the downstrokes. The ink in the well needs another few drops of water, which you add from the glass bottle, stirring slowly until the colour deepens again to its proper blue-black. April of 1860 brings the burial of a young mother, aged 23, and the entry includes the note-wife of William Proctor, labourer, and beneath her name on the same day the burial of her infant daughter, aged 3 days. You read the 2 entries side by side, the mother and child buried together in a single grave, and you copy them without altering your pace, although your hand pauses for a fraction of a second before writing the infant's name. Such entries are not uncommon in the register. You have seen them before in the older pages, the brief lives recorded in 2 lines that sit next to each other on the page like 2 small stones in the churchyard. Your pen completes the transcription, and you blot the page carefully with a fresh sheet. The months of 1860 continue under your hand, May with its single burial of an old labourer, June with 2 more, July empty of deaths for the first month since the year began. The summer entries are always fewer, the warm weather giving a brief reprieve to the old and the young alike, and you note the pattern without commenting on it, copying the few names that appear with the same attention you gave to the crowded winter pages. The light through the window has steadied into a uniform grey-white that speaks of high cloud and a sun that will not break through, and the study has grown comfortable in temperature, the lamp's warmth balancing the cool of the outside air that seeps around the window frame. August of 1860 contains a single burial, a shepherd who died at 61, and was buried on a Tuesday after a long life spent in the fields around the parish. His name familiar to you from the older registers, where he appeared as a baptized infant himself in the year 1799. The entry written in Reverend Throckmorton's hand. The connection between that early baptism and this late burial spans the whole of the old register and beyond. A full human life contained between 2 entries, and you register the fact without sentiment as you copy the name into the new book. September brings 3 burials, all of them children under the age of 5, and you sense in the cluster a possible fever or a bad harvest season with poor nutrition, though the register says nothing of causes and you ask no questions of it. You write the names and ages, the smallest only 4 months old, and the words on the fresh page seem to sit more heavily than the others, though this is only your perception and has nothing to do with the ink or the paper. You continue to the next entry without pause, because the register does not pause, and neither does the work. October and November of 1860 pass under your pen with a scattering of burials, the usual autumn pattern of older parishioners succumbing as the cold crept into the cottages, and the damp rose from the fen. You copy the entries for a blacksmith of 57, a labourer's widow of 82, a carter of 44, and a young man of 19 whose occupation is listed as agricultural labourer, and whose abode is given as Sutterby Thorpe, and you wonder briefly what carried off a strong young man in the prime of his working years, but the register provides no answer, and you do not seek one. The entry is simply there, and you copy it. December of 1860 closes the year with 4 burials, 2 of them in the week before Christmas, and the last entry is dated December the 31st. An old woman of 90, who is the oldest person to appear in this section so far, her age written out carefully by your father with a small note of wonder in the neatness of the numerals. You copy it and rule a line beneath the year, writing the total number of burials for 1860 in the margin, a number that strikes you as high for a parish of this size, though you know the agricultural depression had already begun to press down on the village by then, making food scarce and fuel dear, and the old and the young were the first to feel it. The year 1861 opens its burial record with a January entry on the second day, the ink in the old register dark and fresh-looking as if your father had just filled his pen. The deceased was a labourer of 36, buried by the curate, and you copy the entry, and then the 4 that follow in rapid succession through the rest of January, a month that was clearly as hard in 1861 as it had been the year before. The names come and go under your nib, the letters forming themselves with the practised ease of a hand that has been writing for many hours, and you notice that your fingers no longer ache as they did earlier, the muscles having warmed and loosened into the rhythm of the work. February of 1861 brings a burial that gives you pause, not because the entry is unusual, but because the name is one you know well. The old sexton's wife, buried on February the 10th at the age of 73. Her abode given as the sexton's cottage in the churchyard, a small stone house that you can see from the vicarage window if you lean to the left. You remember her dimly from your childhood, a bent old woman in a black bonnet who used to sit by the lich gate on summer afternoons, and the memory is so faint it hardly seems like a memory at all. More like a story you were told. You copy her name with a steady hand and move on to the next entry. March and April of 1861 are quieter, the burials fewer as winter loosens its hold, and you work through them with the same methodical pace, your pen tracing the familiar patterns of name and date and age. The afternoon outside the window has deepened slightly, the grey light taking on a cooler tone that suggests the sun has passed its zenith, even though no sun is visible through the overcast, and the rooks in the elms have fallen silent, perhaps having flown off to the fields to forage. The only sounds in the study are the scratch of the nib, and the soft rustle of pages turning, and the steady tick of the mantel clock, which has become so much a part of the quiet that you no longer hear it unless you deliberately listen. The summer of 1861 passes in the register with only a handful of burials, and you copy them without hurry, noting the lighter ink your father used in the warmer months when the ink flowed more freely and the pen required less pressure. A shepherd's child in June, a labourer's widow in July, a carter in August who died of an accident, according to a marginal note that you copy faithfully into the new book because it belongs to the record. The note is brief, merely the words "killed by a wagon," and it explains the age of 31 that follows, a young man cut off in the middle of his working life, the fact set down without elaboration. September of 1861 brings a cluster of burials that speaks of an outbreak of something in the parish, perhaps a late summer fever, or a return of the cholera that had visited the county in earlier decades. Though your father made no note of the cause, you copy 5 entries in close succession, all from the same week in the middle of September, and the ages range from 2 years to 58, suggesting a sickness that did not discriminate by age. Then as quickly as it arrived, the cluster ends, and October and November return to the usual scattering of older deaths, the winter pattern reasserting itself. December closes the year with 2 burials, both of elderly labourers, and you write the total at the foot of the page and turn to the new leaf. The year 1862 begins its burial record in January, with an entry that is written in a slightly shaky hand, your father having perhaps been cold in the vestry, or perhaps having been unwell himself that winter. The deceased was an infant of 2 months, the child of a labourer from Sutterby Fen, and the abode is given simply as Fen Cottages, without further detail. You copy it, and then the 3 entries that follow in the same month, all of them winter deaths, all of them belonging to the poorest families in the parish whose cottages would have been damp and draughty in the best of times. As you work through the remaining months of 1862, you notice a gradual change in the register, a thinning of the entries that reflects the shrinking of the parish itself during these years of agricultural depression. Fewer burials in total, not because people were living longer, but because fewer people remained in the village to die there, the young families having moved away to the towns or to the railway works or to the colonies, leaving behind the old and the settled, who had nowhere else to go. The entries you copy in the autumn of 1862 are almost all for elderly parishioners, men and women in their 70s and 80s, whose whole lives had been spent within the sound of St. Ive, Botolph's bell, and you write their names with the quiet recognition of someone who has seen those same names on the older pages, in the baptism and marriage sections stretching back across the decades. The final burial of 1862 is recorded on December the 28th, an old shepherd of 84 who had been born in the parish, baptized in the church, married at the same altar, and now buried in the churchyard within sight of the window where you sit. His name appears 4 times in the old register, as an infant in the baptism pages, as a groom in the marriage section, as the father of children you have already transcribed, and now here at the end of the burial record. You copy the entry with the same care you gave to his baptism many pages ago, closing the circle that the register preserves, and then you rule a line beneath the year and write the total in the margin. The burial section is now complete up to the end of 1862, and you set the pen down across the inkwell, flexing your fingers slowly while the ink on the final page dries to a dull black sheen. The study has grown dimmer around you, the afternoon light outside the window taking on the first faint brassiness that precedes the winter sunset, and you realize that you've been working without pause for a very long time, the quiet of the registers having wrapped itself around you like a blanket. You will continue in a moment, but for now you sit with your hands resting on the blotting pad, looking out at the churchyard where the people you have been copying lie under the grey grass, their names now written in 2 books instead of 1. The mantel clock chimes the half-hour, a single clear note that cuts through the silence of the study and then fades, leaving behind the softer tick that has been your companion all morning. You lift the pen from the page, resting it across the brass rim of the inkwell, with the nib pointing outward over the tray so that no drop falls on the blotting pad, and you wipe your fingers on the flannel rag, feeling the slight stiffness in your knuckles as you straighten them. The work has held you in its rhythm for a long stretch, and your body now reminds you that you have not moved from the wooden chair since you first sat down in the darkness before dawn. You press your palms flat against the edge of the desk and push yourself up slowly, your back straightening with a faint ache between the shoulder blades that speaks of hours bent over the page. Standing in the study, you are aware of the room as a whole for the first time in many hours. The low sloping ceiling with its one dark beam, the shelves of theological works and parish records that line the wall opposite the window, the worn turkey rug that covers the floorboards between the desk and the fireplace, its reds and blues faded to a gentle brownish harmony. The air at standing height is cooler than the air near the lamp, and you feel it touch your cheeks and the back of your neck, where your hair is pinned up. A refreshing coolness that carries the faint, clean smell of the outdoors seeping through the window frame. You stretch your arms upward carefully, not a dramatic gesture, but a slow uncurling of the elbows and wrists, and then you roll your shoulders once, twice, feeling the muscles loosen and the blood move again through your upper back. The sash window draws you across the room, its 12 small panes set in thin glazing bars that your father whitewashed last autumn, and you stand before it with your hands resting lightly on the sill, the wood cool and smooth under your palms. The view from this window has been the same all your life, yet it never presents exactly the same face twice, and you look out now with the quiet attention of someone who has been looking inward at small print and welcomes the wide grey expanse of the Lincolnshire sky. The vicarage garden lies directly below the window, a rectangle of cultivated ground bordered by a low stone wall that needs repointing in 2 places, a task your father has mentioned to the church warden. The vegetable beds nearest the kitchen door have been turned over by the housekeeper's nephew, the dark soil furrowed and waiting, and you can see the first rows of early peas marked out with sticks and twine, though no green shoots have yet appeared. Beyond the vegetable plot, the flower border straggles a little, the lavender bush is grey and woody from the winter, the rose standards wrapped in straw against the frost that still comes at night. A few daffodil spears have pushed up near the sundial, their tips a pale yellow-green that is the only colour in the garden, and you notice that the sundial itself, a flat stone circle on a short pillar, is wet from the morning's mist and reflects the grey sky in a small dull gleam. Past the garden wall, the field road runs straight toward the village, a narrow lane of packed earth and gravel that curves slightly as it passes the churchyard and then disappears between the cottages. No one moves on it now. The surface is dark with damp, and puddles line the wheel ruts where the carrier's cart passed yesterday, their still water catching the pale light from the overcast sky. The hedgerows on either side of the lane are still bare, sharp tangles of hawthorn and blackthorn, and the occasional elder, though you can see the faintest haze of green beginning to show along the twigs, if you look closely. the first intimation of spring that comes early to Lincolnshire, hedges even when the weather stays cold. Beyond the lane, the glebe field stretches away toward the west, a large expanse of heavy clay soil that belongs to the church and provides part of your father's living. The field is in fallow this year, a decision made necessary by the low grain prices that have plagued the county since the agricultural depression tightened, and the furrows from last year's ploughing are still visible, long parallel ridges of dark earth covered now with a thin crop of weeds and the flattened stubble of the previous harvest. Rain from the last week has settled in the low places, and you can see shallow sheets of water glinting in the bottom of the furrows, their surfaces broken by the occasional clump of tough marsh grass that has survived the winter. The field looks heavy and patient, waiting for a dry spell that will allow the plough team to turn us again, though your father has said he may leave it fallow another year until the price of wheat recovers, if it ever does. Your eye travels further, past the glebe field, to the line of tall elms that marks the boundary with the next farm, and in the tops of these elms the rookery sits, a dark cluster of twig nests balanced precariously in the high branches. The rooks themselves are visible as black shapes against the grey sky, some of them perched beside their nests, others circling slowly above the trees with the lazy flap of wings that speaks of restlessness without purpose. Their calls drift to you faintly through the glass, a low cawing that rises and falls, and you watch one bird pull a twig from a branch and carry it to a half-built nest, tucking it in with several quick jabs of its beak. The rooks have been in those elms since long before you were born, and their presence is as much a part of the parish as the church tower itself. Beyond the rooks the land flattens and stretches to the horizon, a wide plain of field and dyke and low hedge that is the landscape of this part of Lincolnshire, with the darker line of the wolds rising very distantly to the east, like a long, low wave frozen in the moment before breaking. The sky above it all is a uniform silver-grey, high and featureless, the kind of sky that can hold for days without releasing either rain or sun, and the light it casts is even and shadowless, flattening the distances so that the far hedges seem closer than they are. In this light, every detail of the land is visible, yet somehow muted, the colours reduced to variations of grey and brown and the darkest green, a landscape painted in thin washes on a damp page. You turn your gaze back to the nearer view, the churchyard on the other side of the lane, where the grey stone tower of St. Botolph rises among the yew trees. The tower is square and solid, built of the local limestone that weathers to a pale silvery grey, and its single bell hangs silent behind the louvered openings of the belfry. You can see the corner of the church roof, the slates dark with moisture, and the line of the chancel window where you know the morning light falls across the altar. The churchyard yews are dense and black, their branches drooping nearly to the ground, and between them the headstones lean at various angles, their inscriptions softened by lichen and weather, till they are barely legible even from a few paces. Some of those stones mark the graves of people you have been copying this morning, and the thought crosses your mind without weight. A simple fact, like the fact of the tower or the rooks. No one walks among the graves. No one comes or goes through the light gate, which stands half open as it always does, its wooden roof shingled with moss. The whole village seems to be holding its breath in the middle of the day, the cottages along the main street sending up no smoke, the doors closed, the windows blank. You know that the men are in the fields where there is work, or in the farmyards, or away seeking day labour in the larger parishes, and the women are inside with their children and their fires and their endless small tasks. The silence that you feel through the glass is not emptiness, but a kind of suspension, the pause that falls over a parish between the morning's labour and the evening's chores. After a long moment, you step back from the window, your breath leaving a faint bloom on the glass that fades almost immediately, and you cross to the small deal table that stands against the wall near the door, where the housekeeper leaves an earthenware jug of water and a plain cup each morning. The jug is brown-glazed pottery, with a handle shaped like a twisted rope, and it sweats slightly in the cool air, the surface beaded with condensation. You lift it with both hands and pour water into the cup, the liquid splashing softly against the clay, and then you set the jug down and raise the cup to your lips. The water is cold and clean, tasting very faintly of the stone cistern in the scullery, and you drink it slowly in small sips, feeling it wash the dryness from your throat. the dryness that comes from breathing the warm air of the lamp for hours. When the cup is empty, you set it back on the table precisely in the center of the small tray where it belongs, and you turn again to face the desk. The room has settled deeper into its afternoon quiet while you stood at the window, the shadows in the corners now slightly longer than they were at midday, the light through the window beginning to take on the subtlest shift toward the gold of late afternoon, though sunset is still many hours away at this time of year. The lamp on the desk still burns with its steady yellow flame, and the two books lie open where you left them, the old register on its cradle and the copybook on the blotting pad, waiting. You walk back to the desk and sit down, drawing the chair forward, feeling the familiar cushion settle under you. Before you take up the pen again, you pause to inspect the old register more closely, turning to the next section that awaits your copying. The pages here, you notice, belong to the early 1870s, the years when the agricultural depression was at its deepest, and the parish was feeling the full weight of the bad harvests and falling prices. But it is not the content of the entries that catches your attention first. It is the state of the ink. These pages were written in a batch of ink that has not aged well. The original black has faded to a pale brown, the color of dry tea leaves, and in many places the letters have become so faint that they seem to float just below the surface of the paper, readable only when the light hits them at the proper angle. The iron gall ink your father mixed that year must have had too little gum arabic or too much water, and over the decades since, the chemical bite of the ink has continued to work on the paper fibers, eating away at the cellulose until the strokes are thin as spider silk. You tilt the page toward the lamp, letting the light fall sideways across the writing, and the shadows in the pen strokes deepen slightly, revealing the words that were nearly lost. It is a trick your father taught you long ago, this reading by indentation, and you use it now as you examine the entries you must copy. The handwriting itself is different in this section, not your father's usual neat and upright script, but the hand of his predecessor's curate, a man whose name you have seen before in the register, Mr. Theodosius Pratt, who served here briefly and whose penmanship was never strong. His letters are spiky and irregular, the downstrokes heavy and splayed where the quill caught the paper, the upstrokes so thin they sometimes vanish entirely. His O's are closed carelessly, leaving gaps that make them look like C's. His capital letters are overly flourished, the loops and curlicues tangling with the lines above and below, and to compound the difficulty, he pressed hard, very hard, so that the back of each page is raised with the braille of his writing, and the letters on the front have bled slightly into the paper fibers, creating a faint halo around each stroke that blurs the edges of the words. You draw the lamp a little closer and bend over the page, tracing the shape of a baptism entry, with your finger held just above the paper, not touching it. The name might be Robert Maltby, or it might be Robert Maltley. The final two letters are a smear, where the nib slipped and the curate attempted a correction, only making the smudge worse. You turn to the burial section for the same year and scan down the column of names, looking for a match that will confirm the spelling, and near the bottom of the page you find it, Maltby, Robert, buried 1873. The confirmation is small but satisfying, a little puzzle solved with patience, and you make a mental note of the correct spelling for when you reach that entry in your copying. Other difficulties await you on these faded pages: a bride's surname that may be Clipsham or Clepston, a child's given name that could be Anne or Amy, depending on how you interpret the smudged final stroke, an abode written so faintly that only the word fen is legible. You will work through these ambiguities one by one, comparing entries across the register, using the context of family names and village geography to deduce what the curate intended. None of this is frustrating to you. It is simply the nature of the task, the quiet detective work of the copyist, and it requires only time and attention, both of which you have in full measure this afternoon. You straighten up, rolling your shoulders once to ease the slight tension that has crept back into your neck while you bent over the page, and you take up the pen from the inkwell, wiping the nib with the flannel rag to remove any dried ink from its tip. The ink in the well has thickened slightly while you were away from the desk, a thin skin beginning to form on its surface, and you stir it carefully with the quill handle until the consistency is uniform again. The afternoon stretches ahead of you, quiet and uninterrupted, and the next pages of the old register are ready to be carried across into the new book. They're faint and difficult letters waiting to be read by the raking light of the lamp and set down afresh in clean black ink. You dip the nib, tap it gently, and lower it to the waiting page. You lower the nib to the page with a deliberation that matches the task ahead, for these faded leaves will not yield their contents as readily as the clear, dark entries you copied from the earlier decades. The old register lies open on its cradle at the year 1870, where the ink has thinned to a ghostly sepia, and the handwriting of Mr. Theodosius Pratt sprawls across the columns like a vine that has grown without a trellis. You draw the lamp a hand's breadth closer, so that its light falls at a sharp angle across the paper, and you see how the raking illumination picks out the tiny ridges and valleys left by the curate's heavy pen, the shadows in the indentations revealing letters that are nearly invisible when viewed straight on. This is the first of the techniques you will use, the reading by touch of the page's surface rather than by color alone, and you settle into it as into a familiar chair. The first entry for January of 1870 is a baptism, and you bend close to read it, your eyes traveling along the faint strokes like someone following a path through thin mist. The child's given name is clear enough, Harriet. The father's name appears to be William, though the double S collapsed into a single wavering line. The surname gives you the first real difficulty, a jumble of angular strokes that could be Stennet or possibly Stennet, the final T uncertain. You turn the old register carefully to the burial pages for the same year and run your finger down the names, finding no matching death for a child of that name, which tells you nothing. Then you check the marriage section for any Stennet in the years before, and there you find a William Stennet who married a Martha in 1868, the spelling clearly with a single T at the end, and you make your quiet decision. You copy the name of Stennet into the new book, forming the letters with your own steady hand, even as the original wavers under your gaze, and then you move on. The second entry is worse. The ink here is not merely faded, but is spread slightly into the paper fibers, creating a soft halo round each letter that blurs the edges into a brownish haze. You read the date as January the 23rd, but the parents' names are a tangle of thin upstrokes and blobby downstrokes, the nib having caught and spattered at the end of a word. You suspect the father's name is Thomas, but the T is almost identical to the curate's F, and the rest of the word could be a short surname rather than a given name. You set the page down and look out the window for a moment to rest your eyes, the grey light of the afternoon washing the colour from the garden, and when you return your gaze to the page, the letters seem to have rearranged themselves slightly. Now the name looks more like Francis, and you compare it to an F and a T elsewhere in the same hand, tracing the differences with the tip of the bone folder held just above the paper. The curate's F has a descender that curls to the left, while his T descends straight. This letter curls left. It is Francis, then, and the wife's name is Anne, written so faintly that only the hump of the N's are visible. You copy them into the new book with the spelling Francis, and you add a tiny pencil dot in the margin of the old register, a habit your father permits in your own books, to mark the place where ambiguity was resolved. February of 1870 presents a page that has suffered from damp at some point, the lower outer corner stained with a brown tide mark that has darkened the paper but left the ink almost untouched, a reversal of the usual problem. The entries here are perfectly legible, the iron gall ink having bitten so deeply into the fibers that the damp has not shifted it, and you copy 3 baptisms in quick succession with a relief that feels like a small gift, the pen moving freely across the new page with no need for hesitation or cross-checking. The children are named George, Eliza, and John, the parents labourers and shepherds from Sutterby and Sutterby Fen, and you write them down with the familiar rhythm that has carried you through the whole of the morning, the nib scratching faintly, the ink flowing in clean dark lines. March brings another difficult hand, though not the curate's this time. Your father had been ill in the spring of 1870 with a bronchial complaint that left him confined to the vicarage for several weeks, and during his absence a visiting clergyman from Horncastle took the services. This man's name is recorded in the register as the Reverend Arthur P. Mead, Dowling, and his handwriting is quite unlike anything you've seen in the book so far. It is small, cramped, and slopes steeply backward, as if the writer had learned his letters under a different system entirely, and his ink is a peculiar shade of grey-green that has aged to a colour like dried moss. You tilt the page this way and that, catching the light, and you puzzle out the entries one letter at a time, feeling the shape of each word with your eyes as a blind person might feel raised type. His A's are closed so tightly, they look like small black knots. His E's have no loops, only a single curved stroke that could be an I if you did not know the context. And his capital letters are studded with unnecessary serifs that make them resemble the ornamental initials in a medieval manuscript, beautiful but nearly illegible. You work through 3 of his entries in March, each one taking twice as long as a normal entry, and you find that the only way to read them accurately is to look away from the page and let the word form itself in your mind before you check it against the visible marks, a sort of educated guess that you then verify, letter by letter, by letter. April of 1870 brings a brief respite. The entries in your father's hand again after he recovered, his familiar upright letters as welcome to your eyes as a known face in a crowd. You copy them with steady speed, the pen dipping and writing, and the new pages fill with clean transcriptions. The names are the same village names you have seen since 1813, Lusby, Mott, Clay, Toynton, Proctor, Dawkins. The repetition of these names across the decades gives the copybook a continuity that you sense without examining, a sense of the parish as a single long story told in fragments, the same families rising and falling, appearing in the baptism pages, and then the marriage pages, and then the burial pages, their small histories contained within the ruled columns. By the time you reach the summer of 1870, you have become accustomed to the rhythm of difficulty, the way the pages alternate between legible stretches and opaque ones, and you no longer feel any tension when you encounter a smudged or faded entry. It is simply part of the work, like a knot in a piece of wood that you must plane around, and you approach each problem with the same methodical patience. A name that cannot be read in the baptism section can often be found in the marriage or burial pages for comparison. A date that is smeared can be checked against the Sundays of that month, for baptisms and marriages almost always took place on Sundays, and the old church calendar hanging in the vestry gives the dates of every Sunday in every year. An abode that is illegible can be guessed from the context of the family's other entries, the same cottage appearing again and again. You make these small deductions without hurry, your mind working quietly in the background while your hands remain still on the desk, and when you are certain you write the entry down and move forward. August of 1870 presents a special challenge, a page where the curate Pratt returned for a single Sunday, his spiky hand even more uncontrolled than before, the letters looping wildly across the lines and straying into the margins. You suspect he had been unwell or perhaps in a great hurry, for the entry is barely coherent, the names jumbled and the date possibly wrong. You read it 3 times, each time tracing the letters with the bone folder held just above the paper, and at last you decide that the child's name is Letitia, a name so uncommon in the parish that it stands out on the page like a single bright thread in a dark cloth. The parents' names you read as Robert and Sarah, and the surname you finally determine to be Maltby, the same family whose burial entry you used as a cross-reference earlier. The confirmation tells you that your reading is correct, and you write Letitia Maltby into the copybook with a sense of quiet satisfaction, the small puzzle solved and set aside. September and October of 1870 pass with fewer entries, the agricultural depression having thinned the parish further, and you copy what there is to copy. 2 baptisms, a marriage, 4 burials. The burials are in your father's hand again, the familiar neat script listing the names of the dead, and you notice that one of them is a child of only 6 months whose father is listed as labourer out of work, the phrase appearing more frequently now in these pages as the depression deepened and the farms shed their workers. You write the words without emphasis, just as your father wrote them, and you blot the page with care. The year 1871 begins with a January so faint that you must hold the old register nearly vertical to the lamp, the light skimming across the surface and throwing the pen strokes into shadow. You work with your head bent low, your breathing slow and shallow, so that no condensation from your lips touches the old paper, and you read the entries aloud in a whisper, your voice the barest thread of sound in the quiet study. Hearing the names spoken helps to distinguish the letters, the shape of the word in your ear confirming the shape on the page, and you copy each one as you speak it. The day outside has moved into mid-afternoon while you worked. the light through the window now beginning to take on the faintest amber undertone, though the sun still hides behind the high grey overcast, and the shadows on the garden wall are only slightly longer than they were at noon. The difficult hands continue through 1871, a page by the curate Pratt, then a page by the Reverend Dowling again, then a long stretch by your father that feels like coming home. You learn the quirks of each writer as you go, building a mental dictionary of their letter forms. Pratt's S that looks like an F, Dowling's R that resembles an N, your father's capital B that has a small extra curl on the lower loop. With this knowledge you become faster, no longer puzzling over every word but recognizing the patterns and filling in the gaps with reasonable confidence. But you do not let confidence become carelessness. Whenever a word is truly uncertain you stop and cross-reference, or you make a tiny note in pencil in the margin of the copybook, a question mark that you will ask your father about this evening when he is settled by the fire with his pipe. These moments of uncertainty are few, but you honor them because the copy must be as exact as you can make it. The winter of 1871 is a lean season in the register, few baptisms and many burials, and you copy the spare entries with a sense of the cold that must have gripped the parish that year, the hard frosts and the shortage of work and the damp cottages taking their toll on the old and the young. Your pen moves across the page recording the names. A shepherd of 71, a labourer's wife of 53, an infant of 2 weeks, a carter of 46, a widow of 88. The ages vary, but the abodes are all the same. Sutterby, Sutterby Fen, Sutterby Thorpe. The geography of the parish is small and contained, and the register maps it without comment, entry by entry. By the time you reach the spring of 1872, the worst of the faded pages are behind you. A new batch of ink appears in the old register, your father having evidently abandoned the faulty mixture and returned to his trusted recipe of 3 parts powder to 1 part gum arabic, and the entries from this point onward are a clear dark brown that has held its color well. The relief you feel is quiet and private, a loosening of the small tension that has lived between your shoulders all afternoon, and you flex your fingers and rub a dab of beef marrow soap into the knuckle of your middle finger, which has begun to protest the long hours of gripping the penholder. You turn a fresh leaf in the copybook and rule a new heading for the year 1873. Your pencil lines faint and straight, and then you lift the old register to check the corresponding page. Here you encounter the final difficulty of this section, a page that has been damaged not by time or poor ink, but by a spill of some kind, perhaps a cup of water or a vase of flowers set too close to the open book. The stain is a pale grey bloom that covers the lower half of the page, and the ink within the stain has run slightly, the letters blurring outward as if seen through a film of tears. You hold the page close to the lamp and then further away, trying different angles, and you find that the most legible view is from a distance of about 18 inches, with the light directly overhead, the blur resolving into recognizable shapes when you do not peer too closely. In this way you read the names: 1 child baptized, 2 adults married, 1 burial. The information is simple enough that the damage has not obscured it beyond recovery, and you copy it with gratitude that the spill was not worse. The afternoon wears on as you work, the light through the window shifting from amber to a deeper gold, the first true color the sky has shown all day, and you realize that the overcast is beginning to break apart far to the west, where a faint band of paler sky has appeared above the horizon. The rooks have returned to the elms and settled into their nests, their cawing now sporadic and drowsy. A single starling lands on the garden wall and sits there for a moment, its dark plumage iridescent even in the flat light, and then it flies away toward the churchyard. You watch these small movements without pausing in your work, your pen continuing its steady progress across the page, the nib dipping and writing with the rhythm of a slow tide. By the time you reach the end of 1873, you have transcribed 3 of the most difficult years in the old register. The faded ink and difficult hands now preserved in clean black letters in the new book, a faithful copy that future readers will be able to consult without straining their eyes or guessing at half-formed words. You rule a line beneath the final entry of the year, write the total in the margin, and set your pen down across the inkwell. The study is quiet, the mantel clock ticking, the lamp burning steady and warm, and you sit for a long moment with your hands resting on the closed leaves of the copybook, feeling the small tiredness in your eyes and the deeper satisfaction of work done with patience and care. Outside, the day has moved into late afternoon, the shadows stretching long across the glebe field, and the church tower of St. Medi Botolph stands dark against the slowly brightening sky, its bells silent, its stones holding the memory of all the names you have written and all the names you have yet to write. The afternoon deepens around you as you turn the old register to the next section, the years 1874 and 1875, waiting in their faded ink on pages that have grown softer with age than the earlier leaves. The paper feeling almost cloth-like under your fingertips, where countless small touches have worn the sizing away. These are the years of the agricultural depression at its deepest point, when the price of wheat fell to levels that ruined the small farmers and left the labourers with no work and no wages. And the register reflects this not in any written comment, but in the spaces between entries. The long gaps where no baptisms were recorded because families had moved away, and in the brief notations in the burial pages where the occupation labourer is followed more often by the words "out of work." You draw the lamplight closer still and prepare to carry these lean years across into the new book. The first page of 1874 opens with a baptism from January, a single entry in a month that in earlier decades would have held 4 or 5, and you copy the name with the recognition that this child, a boy named Edward, was born into a parish already half emptied by the Depression. His father is listed as labourer, Sutterby Fen Cottages, and you know the cottage in question, a small damp building with a sagging roof that stands at the edge of the fen where the drainage dyke curves toward the Witham. You saw smoke rising from its chimney when you looked out the window earlier, the only sign of habitation among a row of 4 that once housed families with children and now shelters only this one couple and their infant. The thought passes through your mind without weight, and you continue to the next entry. February is entirely empty, a blank space in the register where no child was brought to the font, and you note the gap with a small dash in the margin of the copybook before turning the page. The blankness is not an absence of record, but a record of absence, and you treat it as faithfully as you treat the written entries, preserving the silence along with the sound. March offers only a marriage, a couple from the village who had waited many years to wed, and finally did so in a quiet ceremony, with only the sexton and his wife as witnesses. The bride made her mark, a small X that your father recorded with his usual care, and you copy that mark into the new book with the same attention you give to the most elaborate signature. April of 1874 brings the first cluster of baptisms the year has seen. 3 children from 3 different families, all of them labourers who had found work of some kind, perhaps on the drainage works that the county was undertaking during these years to improve the fen, or perhaps at the Grange where the larger farm still operated its steam engines and needed men to tend them. The father's occupations are listed simply as labourer without any qualifying note, and you sense that this detail signals a small improvement in fortunes, a brief period of employment that allowed these families to stay in the parish a little longer. You copy the entries with your steady hand, the nib moving across the page, and the new book fills with the names: Lusby, Clay, a new family called Hargraves, who have appeared for the first time in the register and whose abode is given as Sutterby Thorpe. The summer of 1874 passes in the old register with only 2 further baptisms, both in June, and then a long silence through the harvest months when no children were born, or perhaps none were brought to the church because the families were too poor to afford the tiny fee that custom required. You remember your father waiving that fee many times during these years, pressing the coins back into a labourer's hand with a murmured word that you did not overhear, and you suppose that some of these missing entries might be explained by families who simply did not come, who postponed the baptism until better times that never arrived. The register cannot record what did not happen, and you cannot copy what was never written. You pause in your work and take up the bone folder from its place in the tray, running its smooth edge along the gutter of the new page you have just filled, pressing the paper flat so that it lies open without springing back. The act is small and satisfying, the slight hiss of the bone against the paper joining the other soft sounds of the study, and you take a moment to enjoy the crispness of the new leaves against the worn softness of the old. The copybook is now more than half filled, the clean cream pages covered with your even handwriting, and you have begun to feel a quiet pride in its appearance. The straight columns and the regular spacing, the headings centered perfectly on their lines. You do not dwell on this feeling, but let it pass through you and away, returning your attention to the task. The marriage section for 1874 holds only 2 entries, both in the autumn after the harvest was in, and you copy them with a familiar rhythm, noting that one of the brides came from a parish 20 miles away, a sign that the village was not entirely closed in on itself, even during the worst of the Depression. The witnesses' names include a Toynton and a Proctor, the same families that have appeared in the register since the first pages you copied this morning, and you reflect without words on the continuity that holds the parish together, the way the names persist even as the individuals come and go. Then you turn to the burial pages. December of 1874 brings a cluster of burials that speak of a hard early winter, and you transcribe the names and ages with the same methodical pace you have maintained all day. An old labourer of 76, buried on the 3rd. A carter's widow of 58, buried on the 10th. A child of 4, the daughter of the Hargraves family from Sutterby Thorpe, buried on the 18th. The child's entry is brief, but your father's handwriting shows a slight tremor on the downstrokes, and you remember that winter, the hard frost that lasted from November until February, the way the churchyard path had to be cleared with a shovel before each burial, the frozen plods of earth piled beside the grave. You write the child's name, Mary Ann Hargraves, and you blot the page with a fresh sheet, the ink drying slowly in the cool air of the afternoon. The year 1875 begins with a baptism on New Year's Day, a child brought to the church in the cold morning light while the frost still lay white on the yew branches outside the porch. Your father's entry is written in a hand that is slightly smaller than usual, as if he was conserving ink or perhaps warming his fingers between words, and you copy it exactly as it stands. The father is listed as labourer, and this time there is no qualifying phrase, no out of work appended to the occupation, and you take this as a small sign that the depression was beginning to ease, though you know from memory that the recovery would be slow and partial, never bringing the parish back to the full bustling life of the 1850s. The seasons turn under your hand as you work through 1875, the baptisms coming in the spring and summer months as they always do, the marriages clustered in April and May, and then again in October after the harvest. You copy them all, the familiar names and the occasional new ones, and you notice that the entries are gradually becoming more numerous again, the gaps between them closing slightly as the worst of the depression passed and the parish began to recover. A new family called the Parkers appears in the baptism pages, the father a shepherd at the Grange, and their child is given the ambitious name of Victoria Adelaide, a double royal name that makes you smile faintly as you write it, a small flicker of parental hope preserved in the formal columns of the register. The afternoon light through the window has continued its slow transformation, the band of paler sky that appeared to the west now spreading upward and outward, breaking the uniform grey into long streaks of silver and pearl that shift almost imperceptibly as you watch them between entries. The sun has still not broken through, but it is closer now, the quality of the light richer and deeper than it was an hour ago, and the shadows on the garden wall have lengthened considerably, stretching almost to the kitchen door. The rooks in the elms have grown quiet, settling into their nests for the evening, and a single robin has begun its winter song from somewhere near the sundial, a thin, sweet thread of notes that seems to pierce the quiet without disturbing it. You dip your pen more frequently now, because the ink in the well has grown thicker from the long hours in the warm lamp circle, and you stir it with the quill handle whenever the flow begins to feel sluggish, adding a few drops of rainwater from the glass bottle to keep the consistency right. The act of stirring has become part of the rhythm, a small punctuation mark between entries, and you do it without thinking, your hands knowing the motions that your mind no longer needs to direct. The smell of the ink is fainter now than it was this morning, the sharp metallic tang having dissipated into the general atmosphere of the study, blending with the beeswax and the coal dust and the faint clean scent of the outdoors that seeps around the window frame. The temperature in the room has dropped slightly as the afternoon wears on, the warmth of the lamp no longer quite sufficient to hold back the chill that creeps in from the stone walls and the unheated corridor beyond the study door, and you draw your shawl closer around your shoulders with one hand while the other continues to guide the pen. The grey wool is warm and familiar, and you tuck it more securely under your arms, feeling the slight weight of it settle across your back. Later, you will need to add coal to the grate, But for now, the chill is not uncomfortable, merely present. A reminder that the day outside is still a winter day, even though the calendar has moved into early spring. The summer of 1875 occupies several pages of the old register, with a modest increase in baptisms, and you copy them with the same steady care. The names forming themselves under your nib in letters that have become slightly smaller as the afternoon wears on, your hand conserving energy without conscious direction. A baptism in June for a child named Thomas, son of the new Parker family. Another in July for a child named Sarah, daughter of a labourer named John Stennett. A third in August for twin girls born to the Toyntons. An unusual event that your father recorded with a small note of exclamation in the margin. A rare departure from his usual restraint, and you copy both the entry and the marginal note, because both belong to the record. The marriage section for the second half of 1875 contains a single entry, a wedding in November between a labourer from Sutterby and a woman from the neighbouring parish of Revesby, the ceremony performed by the curate from Horncastle while your father was laid up with a return of his bronchial complaint. The curate's handwriting is the same pale spidery script you spent the morning deciphering, but this entry is clearer, the ink fresher and the penmanship less hurried, and you copy it without difficulty, adding the names to the growing column in the new book. The burial pages for late 1875 bring a scattering of entries that you transcribe one by one, the names of the old and the young set down in your father's hand, with the same spare dignity he always used. The final burial of the year is an old shepherd named Thomas Lusby, aged 81, whose name you have seen in every section of this register going back to the earliest pages you copied, a life that spanned the whole of the centuries so far, and you write his name in the copybook with the sense that you were closing a door very gently on a long and quiet story. Then you rule a line beneath the year and write the total in the margin, a modest number that reflects the thinning of the parish during the Depression years. You set the pen down across the inkwell and sit back in the chair, your spine pressing against the worn tapestry cushion, and you let your hands rest palm down on the blotting pad while you take a long, slow breath. The copybook now contains the record up to the end of 1875, the most difficult years faithfully transcribed, the faded ink, and the difficult hands and the blank spaces all carried across into the new leather volume that will stand on the shelf beside its predecessor. The light through the window has taken on the unmistakable quality of late afternoon. The sky beyond the garden, now a pale gold at the horizon, shading upward into a soft blue-grey, the first blue you have seen all day, and the glebe field lies in long shadows that stretch nearly to the hedge. In the quiet of the study, the mantel clock continues its steady ticking, a sound that has measured every entry you have written since you first sat down in the darkness before dawn and the lamp burns on, its flame steady behind the glass chimney. You are not yet finished, but the end of the work is now within sight. A few more years remaining in the old register, and you will complete them with the same patience that has carried you through the long afternoon. The old register now lies open to its final pages, the leaves that carry the parish record through the years 1876 and 1877, the very edge of the present moment. These pages are written entirely in your father's hand, the ink a consistent dark brown that has not yet begun to fade, the letters crisp and legible because they were set down only a short while ago, some of them within the last 12 months. You turn to them with a sense of approaching the end, not of haste, but of quiet recognition, the feeling a walker has when the familiar spire of home comes into view across the fields at dusk. The afternoon outside the window has deepened into full late afternoon gold, the band of pale sky at the horizon now spread across half the heavens, and the shadows in the room have grown long and soft, reaching from the desk toward the fireplace like dark fingers stretching in the cooling air. The year 1876 begins with a baptism in January, a single entry for a child named George William, son of John and Harriet Dawkins of Sutterby Thorpe, Carter. You copy it with the same measured pace you have used all day, the pen dipping and writing, the letters forming themselves in your familiar round hand. The Dawkins name has appeared many times in these pages, a steady family that has remained in the parish through the worst of the Depression, and you set down this newest entry beside all the others you have transcribed, a small addition to the long record. February follows with no entries at all, and you note the gap with a dash before turning to March, where a single baptism and a single marriage occupy barely half a page between them, the parish still sparse and quiet as it crept towards spring. The pages for the rest of 1876 fill slowly under your hand. A baptism in April, a marriage in May, another baptism in June, a scattering of burials through the summer and autumn that reflect the usual pattern of older deaths in the colder months. You work with the same careful attention, checking every name against the original, verifying each date and abode, and the copybook grows thicker on the left as the old register grows thinner on the right, the weight of the task shifting visibly from one volume to the other. The ink in the well has lasted well, though you have had to add water twice more, and the nib has worn to a smoothness that makes the writing almost effortless, the point gliding over the paper with the faintest whisper of resistance. The marriages for 1876 bring a small pleasantry to your eye, a wedding in September between a young labourer and a girl who had been a pupil teacher at the village school before it closed. Her signature recorded in a neat, confident hand that speaks of her training, and you copy it with a sense of the small threads of education that persisted in the parish even as the population shrank. The witnesses include the girl's former schoolmistress, a name you recognise as having moved away to Spilsby some years ago, and the entry preserves this connection like a pressed flower between the pages. Then the burial pages close the year with the names of 3 elderly parishioners, and you write the totals at the foot of the leaf before preparing for the final year. The year 1877 begins on a fresh page of the old register, and you realize as you open it that these are the most recent entries, the ones that bring the record up to within a few months of the present day. The January light must have been cold and grey when your father wrote these words, and you can see where his hand trembled slightly on the downstrokes, a small sign of the rheumatism that has begun to trouble his writing hand in the damp weather. There is a baptism on the 6th, a child named Anne Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas and Mary Clay of Sutterby, labourer, and you copy it with the knowledge that this infant is now a few months old, perhaps being carried to the church even this Sunday past, wrapped in the same christening gown that has clothed generations of Clays before her. The thought is gentle and passing, and you do not dwell on it. February of 1877 holds no entries, the still heart of winter when the parish huddled indoors and the font stood dry. March offers only a burial. An old woman of 85 who had outlived 2 husbands and all her children, her name recorded simply as Widow Toynton, and you copy it with the same spare dignity that the entry itself conveys. Then the pages move into the spring, and you transcribe a handful of baptisms and a single marriage, the familiar rhythms of parish life asserting themselves once more as the season turned. The afternoon light through the window has shifted again, the gold now deepening to a rich amber that picks out the grain of the deskwood and turns the brass inkwell to a pool of warm light, and you feel the day moving toward its close even as the work approaches its end. The rooks have fallen entirely silent in the elms, and the robin has ceased its evening song, leaving only the distant lowing of a cow from somewhere on the Gleefield, a sound so faint it might almost be a memory. The mantelcock continues its steady measure, and you match your rhythm to it without conscious effort, the pen lifting and dipping, the pages turning, the quiet accumulating in the room like a soft dust. Now you arrive at the final page of the old register that requires copying. It is a leaf toward the very back of the burial section, and it contains only a single entry, written in your father's hand, with a care that you recognize as the special attention he gives to the hard moments of his pastoral duty. The date is the 15th of April of this present year, 1877, only 3 weeks past. The entry records the burial of a child, a boy of 18 months, named John Robert, the son of Samuel and Martha Singleton, of Sutterby Fen Cottages, labourer. The age is written in clear numerals, the name spelled out in full with the middle name included, and at the bottom of the entry the officiating minister is recorded as the Reverend Augustus Thornton, your own father, his signature written with the same upright letters you have known all your life. You pause as you read this entry, not out of sorrow but out of a quiet recognition that this is the last piece of the task, the final name to be carried across from the old book to the new. The child lived his brief life in the Fen Cottages that you can just see from the window if you lean to the left, a small damp dwelling at the edge of the lowest field, and you remember your father walking down there on a cold spring morning 3 weeks ago with his supplies folded under his coat, his breath white in the air, to conduct the burial of the smallest parishioner. The entry is now before you, and you have only to copy it as you have copied all the others. You dip the nib with particular care, tapping away the excess ink so that no blot will mar the final entry. You check the date column twice, verifying that the numerals are correct, and you read the names again, the father's, the mother's, the child's, each one distinct and true. Then you lower the pen to the page and write. The letters form themselves with the same even spacing you gave the first entry hours ago, the same steady pressure on the downstrokes, the same light lift on the curves. John Robert Singleton of Sutterby Fen Cottages, aged 18 months, buried April the 15th, 1877. You write your father's name at the end, not as his daughter, but as a copyist recording the officiating minister, and the letters of his name appear under your nib with a strange familiarity, as if you are seeing them for the first time even though you have seen them all your life. When the final letter is complete, you lift the pen and hold it poised for a moment, looking at the entry you have just written. The ink gleams wetly in the lamplight, a dark mirror that reflects the flame for an instant before the surface dulls to a soft sheen. This is the last line, the completion of the copy, the end of the long task that has held you in its quiet rhythm since before dawn. You do not feel triumph or relief, only a calm sense of finesse, the simple satisfaction of having done what was asked of you with care and patience and a steady hand. You set the pen down across the inkwell and reach for the old register, the worn leather volume that has been your companion through these hours. You close it gently, supporting the front board with your left hand so that no strain falls on the joint, and you feel the weight of the pages settling against each other as the book comes together. The faint puff of air that escapes from between the leaves, carrying with it the dry scent of old paper and time. You rest your palm on the cover for a moment, the leather smooth and warm under your skin, and then you set the old register aside on the desk to your left, its work now completed. The copybook lies open before you, its final page still wet with the ink of the last entry. You take up the sandshaker from its place in the tray, the small pewter canister cool in your fingers, and you hold it over the page, tapping it gently so that a fine dusting of grey sand falls in an even pattern across the wet line. The sand settles on the ink, and you watch as the gleam of moisture begins to fade, the dark letters drying to a permanent black under the thin grey coating. You leave the sand to do its work, and while you wait, you align the pages of the copybook, lifting each leaf slightly to ensure that none have stuck together, that the gutters are all pressed flat, that the ruled columns run straight from the front to the back. The book is orderly and complete, every entry in its place, every name preserved. A few moments pass, and you judge the ink dry enough. You lift the page carefully and tip the sand into the waste pot that sits at the corner of the desk, tapping the paper lightly to dislodge any remaining grains. The page beneath is clean, the letters crisp and unblurred, and you run your eye down the column one last time to confirm that all is well. Then you close the copybook, bringing the heavy front board over the pages with the same gentle care you gave the old register, and you feel the slight resistance of the new leather as it bends for the first time at the hinge. The book settles closed with a soft thump, and you place your hands on the cover, feeling the blind-tooled lines under your fingers, the small gold circle with its serifed letters, the cool, smooth surface that will now begin its own long life on the shelf where the old register has sat for 60 years. For a long moment you simply sit with your hands resting on the closed book, your breathing slow and even, your shoulders relaxed. The light through the window has turned fully golden, the low sun having finally broken through the cloud cover to cast long, slanted rays across the garden, the lawn, the churchyard beyond. The shadows of the elm trees stretch across the glebe field in dark blue stripes, and the tower of St. Botolph blows warmly, its grey stone turned amber by the late light. The day outside is ending, and the quiet in the study has deepened to a stillness that feels almost tangible, a held breath before the evening begins. You sit in this stillness for a stretch of time that you do not measure, letting the work settle behind you, letting the names you have written rest in their new home. Then you stir, lifting your hands from the book, and you attend to the final small tasks that will close the desk and end the session. The nib is the first thing you tend to. You unscrew it from the wooden holder, careful not to bend the tines, and you wipe it thoroughly with a flannel rag, removing every trace of dried ink from the slit and the underside and the iridium tip, until the steel gleams clean. You place the nib back in the wooden tray beside its fellows, the Gilotte's barrel point that has served you faithfully through the whole of the task, and you wipe the holder as well, the plain wood worn from your grip. The inkwell you cover with its little brass lid, pressing it down firmly to keep the dust out, and you set the well aside to be cleaned tomorrow, when the remaining ink can be poured back into the stock bottle or discarded and the china bowl washed with rainwater. The sandshaker you return to its place, the blotting paper you stack neatly, the bone folder and the brass ruler and the pot of beef marrow soap all go back into the tray in their proper order, until the desk looks exactly as it did when you first opened it in the darkness before dawn. Now the two books must be shelved. You take the old register first, the worn volume that carries the parish record from 1813 onward, and you rise from the chair to carry it across the room to the narrow shelf above the desk. The book slides into its place between its fellows with a soft rasp of leather against leather. The line of dark calf spines now once again complete, the gilt dates on the spines reading in order from left to right. You touch the spine once, lightly, and then you return to the desk for the copybook. The new volume is heavier than the old one, its board still stiff with newness, its leather unsoftened by handling. You lift it with both hands and carry it to the shelf, where you have already cleared a space to the right of the old register. The book fits precisely, the same height, the same depth, and you align it so that its spine sits flush with the others, the oxblood leather a fresh note among the darkened older bindings. The gold circle on the front board catches the lamplight and glints once before settling into shadow. The sparium will remain here now, a fair copy of the parish records, ready for the bishop's visitation or for any future need, a safeguard against the loss of the older book, by fire or damp or simple age. You step back from the shelf and look at the row of volumes, the old and the new standing side by side, a continuous record of the parish that stretches back beyond your birth and will stretch forward beyond your life. The thought is not grand or solemn, but simply true, and you let it rest in your mind for a moment before turning back to the desk. The desk still holds the lamp, which burns with its steady flame, and the closed roll-top with its slatted cover waits for you to draw it down. You reach up and take hold of the wooden pawl, and you slide the cover forward slowly, the slats riding smoothly in their grooves, closing over the empty desk where your hands have worked all day. The cover meets the desktop with a soft click, and you turn the small brass key in the lock, the mechanism sliding home with a sound that is final without being heavy, a small full stop at the end of a long sentence. You stand beside the desk for a moment, your shawl still wrapped around your shoulders, your hands loose at your sides. The study around you is dim now. The lamps glow, the only light left in the room, and the world outside the window has moved into the deep gold of imminent sunset, the sky streaked with long bands of amber and rose above the flat horizon. The churchyard yews are black silhouettes against the coloured sky, and the tower of St. Botolph stands dark and solid, its bells silent, its stones holding the names of all the dead you have copied today. A single star has appeared in the pale upper sky, a point of cold light that waxes and wanes as the atmosphere shifts. You reach for the lamp, lifting it carefully by its wire handle, and the circle of light sways gently as you carry it across the room. The shadows in the corners swing and resettle, the bookshelves and the fireplace and the dark portrait of the long-dead bishop, all passing through the moving light like figures in a dream. You pause at the door to look back at the study one last time. The desk closed and locked, the shelf of registers complete, the window showing the last of the day's gold fading into grey. The room is tidy and quiet, and it will wait here in the darkness until someone comes again to open it. You turn the brass knob and step out into the passage, pulling the study door closed behind you with a gentle click. The air in the corridor is cooler than the study air, and you feel it on your cheeks as you walk, the lamplight showing the way past the green baize door and toward the back staircase. The house around you is waking to evening. From the kitchen, at the end of the passage, you hear the faint clatter of a kettle being set on the hob, the murmur of the housekeeper's voice speaking to the kitchen maid, the soft thump of a cupboard door closing. The smells of the evening meal are beginning to drift up the passage, a warmth of broth and baking that mingles with the clean, cold scent of the outside air coming in through the scullery door. Somewhere above you, your father's footsteps move across the landing, slow and familiar, the sound of his day drawing to its close as yours draws to its close. You carry the lamp up the narrow back stair, the flame steady in your hand, the shadows shifting on the plaster walls. At the top of the stair you turn toward your room, and you pause for a moment at the window on the landing, looking out at the same view you saw this morning in the darkness. The fields are now a deep blue-grey under the sunset sky, the dikes reflecting the last of the light in long silver lines, and the village is a scatter of yellow-lit windows where the cottages have lit their evening candles. The smoke from a single chimney rises straight up into the still air, a pale column against the darkening east. You watch for a moment longer, and then you turn away, carrying the lamp into your room, where you will set it on the chest and sit on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet of the evening settle around you. The registers are copied. The day is done,